The slap of leather across her cheek was not the worst thing Martha Whitaker had survived that winter, but it would be the last one she allowed. She did not cry out. She wiped her face with her glove, looked the man dead in the eye and said, "Apologize before supper, or you eat nothing. I cook again." 12 cowboys went silent because no one had ever spoken to Wade Mercer that way and lived to see sundown. None of them knew the quiet man watching from the barn door already owned every acre beneath their boots. If you're watching this from your porch, your kitchen table, or your favorite chair tonight, tell us what city you're tuning in from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single moment of Martha and Caleb's story. There's heartbreak ahead, there's justice ahead, and there's a love neither of them saw coming. Stay with us until the end. The slap of leather against her cheek was not the worst thing that had happened to Martha Whitaker that winter, but it was the last one she would ever allow. She did not cry out. She did not step back. She wiped the sting from her face with the back of her glove, looked the man dead in the eye, and said, "You'll apologize before supper, or you'll eat nothing I cook for the rest of your days here." Behind her, 12 cowboys went dead silent, because no one in the history of Red Valley Ranch had ever spoken to Wade Mercer like that and lived to see the sun set. What none of them knew was that the man watching from the barn door, arms crossed, saying nothing, already owned every acre beneath their boots. 3 weeks before that slap, Martha Whitaker stood at the gate of Red Valley Ranch with a bag in her hand that had been her mother's and a coat that had seen better winters. Snow fell sideways across the Montana Valley, biting at her cheeks, and she did not flinch. She had walked the last 4 miles from the stage stop because the driver would not wait for her to finish loading her bag, and she was not about to beg a stranger for patience she'd learned to live without. The ranch house sat low and long against the white hills, smoke curling from its chimney, and beyond it stretched the bunkhouses, the barns, the corrals full of restless horses stamping against the cold. A dozen men worked the yard breaking ice from the water troughs, hauling feed, shouting to one another in the rough language of men who worked outdoors for a living. When they saw her walking up the frozen road alone carrying her own bag, they stopped what they were doing. "Well, would you look at that?" One of them called out, a stocky man with a gap in his front teeth and tobacco stains on his collar. "Looks like Christmas came early, boys." Laughter rippled through the yard. Martha kept walking, her boots crunching in the snow, her chin level, her eyes fixed on the ranch house door. "Where you headed, miss?" another one asked, stepping into her path. He was younger, maybe 20, with a sneer that had not yet learned shame. "This ain't a place for a lady out for a Sunday stroll." "I'm not out for a stroll," Martha said. Her voice was calm, low, steady as a held breath. "I'm here about the cook position." The yard erupted. Men doubled over laughing, slapping their knees, pointing at her coat, her size, the plainness of her boots. "Cook position?" the stocky one repeated, wiping his eyes. "Lord Almighty, we asked for a cook, not a—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. His eyes did the rest, sliding over her body the way men do when they think unkindness is the same as wit. Martha did not look away. She did not shrink. She had spent 28 years learning exactly how to stand in a room full of people who had already decided what she was worth before she opened her mouth, and she had learned that the only power she had was refusing to agree with them. "I can cook better than anyone you've hired in the last 5 years, she said. "I can bake bread that'll make a grown man cry for his mother. I can organize a pantry so nothing spoils and nothing runs short. I can mend, I can clean, and I can be up before the rooster and still have coffee hot and biscuits ready when you drag yourselves out of your bunks. You can laugh all you like. It won't change whether or not you're hungry come morning." That quieted a few of them, though not all. The young one with the sneer stepped closer, close enough that Martha could smell the whiskey on him even at 10 in the morning. "We don't need no fat woman telling us what she can do. We need somebody easy on the eyes to bring us our coffee." "Then you'll be waiting a long while," Martha said, "because I hear the last 3 cooks you hired quit inside of a month, and one of them left in the middle of the night without so much as a note. Seems to me pretty don't fill a belly." A few of the older hands chuckled at that low and reluctant, the kind of laugh that comes when someone unexpected lands a punch you didn't see coming. The young one flushed red and opened his mouth to fire back, but a voice cut through the yard before he could. "That's enough!" The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It came from the barn door where a man stood with his hat pulled low, a coil of rope over one shoulder, watching the whole scene with an expression Martha couldn't quite read. He was tall-built, lean and hard, the way men get from real work rather than boasting about it somewhere past 30, with a face weathered by sun and wind and things he didn't talk about. He didn't laugh. He hadn't laughed once, not since she'd walked through the gate, and that alone made him different from every other man in that yard. "Foreman's inside," the tall man said, nodding toward the ranch house. "Go on in. He's the one hiring." Martha looked at him a moment longer than she meant to. There was something steady in his eyes, something that didn't ask anything of her and didn't offer pity either. Just attention. Just the plain fact of being seen without being measured. "Thank you," she said. He tipped his hat just barely and said nothing more. She walked past the men, past their stares, and their half-swallowed laughter, and knocked on the door of the ranch house. It opened almost immediately, as though someone had been standing on the other side waiting for the commotion outside to bring a visitor. The foreman was a heavy-set man named Otis Grady, with a beard going gray at the edges and eyes that had seen 40 winters on that land. He looked her over, the way a man looks over a horse he's thinking of buying, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "You're here for the cook job," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am. You got references. I've got hands that don't quit, and a memory for how to feed 20 men on a budget that would starve most cooks' pride. That's all the reference I've got because I've never needed to keep letters proving what I can do. My cooking proves it." Otis studied her a long moment. Behind him through the window, Martha could see the men in the yard still watching, still muttering among themselves. "You know this is hard work," Otis said. "Up before dawn, feeding a crew that's cold-tired and mean as snakes half the time. No days off in calving season. Kitchens in bad shape. Stoves near broke, pantries a mess since the last one left in a hurry." "Good," Martha said. "Give me something broken. I know how to fix things." Something in Otis's face shifted, not quite a smile, but close to respect. "Pays $12 a month, room in the cookhouse, meals same as the crew. You start today, you'll have supper on the table by 6, or you're gone by morning." "I'll have supper on the table by 6, Martha said, "and it'll be better than anything this ranch has eaten since your mother's cooking. God rest her if she's passed." Otis let out a short laugh, surprised out of him. "She's very much alive, and would skin you for that comparison. Cookhouse is out back past the smokehouse. Go on and see what you're working with." Martha thanked him, and stepped back out into the cold, and the eyes of every man in that yard found her again as she crossed toward the small building set apart from the others, its chimney cold, its door hanging slightly crooked on rusted hinges. She did not look at the men as she passed. She had learned long ago that looking back only fed the fire. The cookhouse was worse than she'd imagined. The stove sat cracked along one side, its door barely hanging by a single hinge. The pantry shelves were half-collapsed flour sacks torn open and gone to weevils. Dried beans scattered across the floor, where something with sharp teeth had gotten into them. The table in the center of the room was scarred and warped, one leg propped up with a stack of old boards. Dust and cobwebs hung thick in every corner, and the whole place smelled of mildew and neglect. Martha set her bag down on the least dusty corner of the table and stood there a long moment, taking it all in. Then she rolled up her sleeves. By noon she had swept the floor twice, thrown out what couldn't be saved, and started a fire in the one working section of the stove, using wood she'd found stacked half-frozen behind the smokehouse. By 2, she had found a hand mirror's worth of usable flour, sifted the weevils from what remained, and started mixing dough with water she'd hauled, and heated herself since no one had offered to help, and she hadn't asked. The men came and went through the yard all afternoon, some glancing toward the cookhouse with curiosity. Most ignoring it entirely, certain the fat woman with the old bag would be gone by nightfall one way or another. Only one man didn't ignore it. Martha noticed him from the window as she worked the tall one from the yard, moving quietly to the woodpile near the cookhouse and splitting logs, stacking them by her door, without a word, without waiting for thanks, without even looking toward the window to see if she'd noticed. She had noticed. By 5:30, the smell of bread and beans and salted pork drifted out across the yard, thick and rich, the kind of smell that stops a working man in his tracks whether he wants it to or not. By 6, when Otis rang the supper bell, the men filed into the cookhouse and found the table set patched, but set the broken leg braced solid with a wedge Martha had carved herself from a scrap of pine and bowls of stew, steaming in front of every seat and bread still warm enough to release its heat when broken open. They ate in silence, at first the kind of silence that comes from men too surprised to talk. Then one of the older hands, a wiry man named Del Hutchins, with a face like cracked leather, set down his spoon and said, "This is the best meal I've had on this ranch in 3 years." "Damn right," muttered another mouth still full. The stocky man from the yard, the one who'd made the Christmas joke, ate 3 bowls without a word and refused to meet Martha's eyes when she came around refilling cups. The young one, whose name she would later learn was Boone Tally, sulked over his plate but ate every bite because pride doesn't fill a belly any better than it warms a bed. Only one man at that table said nothing at all, not because he had no words, but because he seemed to prefer watching. The tall one from the barn door sat near the end of the table, ate his stew slowly, and when Martha came by with the coffee pot, he held out his cup without looking up and said quiet enough that only she could hear, "Thank you, ma'am." "You're the one who told me where to find the foreman," Martha said, pouring, "and the one who's been stacking wood by my door all afternoon. Didn't think you'd want to split it yourself in this cold." "I didn't ask you to." "No, ma'am, you didn't." He said nothing more, and Martha moved on down the table, but she found herself glancing back at him more than once before the meal was through. He ate quietly, spoke to no one, and left before dessert, nodding once to Otis on his way out the door. Nobody else seemed to think it strange. Martha did not yet know why. That night, after the dishes were scrubbed and the fire banked low, Martha sat alone in the small back room of the cookhouse that would be hers and unpacked her bag by lamplight. There wasn't much in it. A spare dress, her mother's Bible, a tin of buttons, a folded letter she hadn't opened in 3 years, because she already knew every word of it by heart and didn't need the paper to remind her how much it had hurt. She set the letter at the bottom of the bag beneath everything else, and did not think about it again that night. She thought instead about the tall, quiet man, and the way he hadn't laughed. The next morning Martha was up before the sun, as she'd promised, coffee brewing and biscuits rising by the time the first cowboy stumbled bleary-eyed into the cookhouse. Word of her cooking had apparently traveled overnight, because by breakfast the whole crew was seated and waiting quieter than they'd been the day before, watching her with the wary curiosity of men who'd expected her to fail and were now uncertain what to make of her success. "You always up this early?" Del Hutchins asked, accepting a plate of eggs and ham. "Every day," Martha said. "A cook who sleeps late is a cook who serves cold food, and cold food is an insult to hard-working men." "Well, I ain't gonna argue with that philosophy," Del said and dug in. Boone Tally, however, was not so easily won over. He sat at the far end of the table, arms crossed, watching Martha move around the kitchen with an expression that curdled more the longer he looked. "I still don't see why we needed a woman like her," he muttered to the man beside him, not quite low enough. "Could have hired someone easier to look at." Martha heard it. She always heard it. She had trained herself over the years to hear every unkind word, and let none of them land, but that morning, for reasons she couldn't fully name, the words settled somewhere colder than usual. She set Boone's plate down in front of him without comment and turned back to the stove. It was the tall man who spoke this time, not loudly, but with a weight that made the whole table pause. "Tally." Boone looked up. "She's been on this ranch one day and already cooked 2 meals better than anything you've eaten here in months. You want to keep complaining, you can go complain to Otis about finding your own breakfast." Boone's face went red, but he said nothing more, shoveling eggs into his mouth with sudden focus. The rest of the table exchanged glances, and Martha, standing at the stove with her back half turned, felt something in her chest loosen, just slightly, though she wasn't sure yet if she trusted the feeling. "You didn't have to do that," she said later when the others had cleared out to start the day's work, and only the tall man remained finishing his coffee at the table. "Didn't do it for you," he said, standing, setting his cup down gently. "Did it because it's true. Man ought to say what's true, even when it's easier not to. Most men don't bother with that distinction. Most men aren't worth much then." He picked up his hat from the table, settled it on his head, and paused at the door. "Name's Caleb Rowan, ma'am, in case nobody bothered to introduce themselves proper." "Martha Whitaker." "I know," Caleb said. "Heard you tell Otis yesterday you don't need references because your cooking speaks for you." A faint shadow of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but close enough kin to it. "Reckon you were right about that." He left before she could answer, and Martha stood in the doorway of the cookhouse for a long moment, watching him cross the yard toward the corrals, wondering why a ranch hand's opinion mattered to her at all, when she'd spent years teaching herself that opinions, kind or cruel, didn't change the truth of who she was or what she was worth. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Martha rose before dawn, built the fire, mixed the dough, fried the meat, boiled the coffee strong enough to wake the dead. She scrubbed the cookhouse floor to floor until the boards gleamed under the lamplight, mended the pantry shelves with nails she found in the barn, and organized the stores so carefully that not a single sack of flour or string of dried apples went to waste. Within 2 weeks, the cookhouse that had been a ruin when she arrived had become, in the words of old Del Hutchins, the finest kitchen this side of the Missouri. But not every man on Red Valley Ranch had softened toward her. Boone Talley nursed his wounded pride like a grudge he intended to keep alive through the whole winter, muttering comments under his breath whenever he thought Martha couldn't hear comments about her size, her plainness, her presumption in thinking she belonged among men who worked with their hands and their backs instead of their aprons and spoons. A few of the younger hands took their cues from him, snickering when she passed, leaving cruel little notes tucked under her salt cellar crude drawings, unkind words, the kind of small cowardices that men commit when they lack the nerve to say something to a person's face. Martha found the notes, read them once, and burned every single one in the stove without a word to anyone. She had learned that lesson long before Montana, in a town whose name she tried not to think about, where cruelty had worn a much crueler face than a scrawled note under a salt cellar. She would not give these boys the satisfaction of her tears. She had none left to spare for men who hadn't earned them. Caleb noticed the notes disappearing into the stove, though he said nothing about it for a while. He noticed the way Martha's shoulders tightened whenever Boone passed too close, the way her jaw set hard when the younger hands laughed just a beat too long after she left a room. He noticed, and he began finding small ways to ease the burden without ever making it seem like charity chopping wood before she had to ask mending the crooked cookhouse door on a Sunday, when he could have been resting hauling extra water so she wouldn't have to make 3 trips to the well in the freezing cold. "You don't have to keep doing this," Martha told him one afternoon, finding him on his knees by her door with a hammer and a fresh hinge, fixing what had been broken since before she'd arrived. "I know," Caleb said, not looking up from his work. "Then why do you—" He was quiet for a moment, testing the hinge, swinging the door back and forth to see that it moved true. Man sees something broke that he's got the tools and the time to fix, seems foolish to walk past it just because nobody asked him to stop. That's not really an answer. Caleb straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers, and looked at her with those steady eyes that never seemed to demand anything of her. Maybe it is, and maybe you just don't like it, 'cause it means somebody's paying attention who don't want nothing in return. Martha didn't have a response for that. She stood in the cold with her arms crossed, watching him gather his tools, and something in her chest ached in a way she didn't have a name for yet. Something halfway between gratitude and suspicion. Because in her experience, kindness with no strings attached was the rarest currency in the world, and rare things made her nervous in ways cruelty never had. "Supper's near ready," she said finally. "You'll want to wash up." "Yes, ma'am." He tipped his hat and walked off toward the bunkhouse, and Martha stood a moment longer in the cold before going back inside to check on the stew. That night at supper, the tension in the cookhouse simmered under the surface the way it had for days. Boone Talley had been drinking, though the ranch rules forbade it, sneaking sips from a flask he kept hidden in his coat. and by the time he sat down at the table, his eyes had gone glassy and mean. "You know," he said loudly to no one in particular, though everyone at the table heard him, "I heard some ranches got standards about who they let cook for a crew. Heard some places want somebody who don't take up half the bench." A few of the men shifted uncomfortably. Del Hutchins shot Boone a warning look. Martha at the stove with her back to the table felt her hands go still over the pot she was stirring, felt the old familiar heat rise in her chest, the one she'd trained herself over years to swallow rather than show. "Tally," Del said low. "That's enough." "I'm just saying," Boone pressed on, emboldened by the whiskey, and by whatever small cruelty was left unanswered in him. "Man's gotta wonder why a woman built like a barn wall couldn't find work anywhere better than a ranch full of desperate cowboys who ain't got no other choice but to eat what she's serving." The room went silent. Martha set down her spoon very carefully and turned to face the table. Her face was calm, her voice steadier than the storm rising in her chest. "Mr. Tally," she said, "I have fed you 3 meals a day for 2 weeks, mended your torn coat without you asking, and never once complained when you tracked mud across my clean floor. I don't require your approval of my body to know my own worth, and I certainly don't need it to keep doing my job better than anyone this ranch has ever hired. If you'd like to keep insulting me, you're welcome to find your own supper from now on, because I won't be feeding a man who can't extend common decency to the woman filling his belly." A few of the older hands actually applauded low and rough, banging their spoons against the table in appreciation. Boone's face went dark red, humiliation curdling into something uglier, and he opened his mouth to fire back something worse. But before he could speak, Caleb's chair scraped back from the table, slow and deliberate, and the whole room's attention shifted toward him. "Tally," Caleb said, quiet as always, but with an edge underneath the quiet that hadn't been there before. "Apologize." "I don't answer to you," Boone snapped, though his voice wavered. "You will tonight." Caleb's eyes did not leave Boone's face. "You've been drinking on ranch time, which is grounds enough to send you off without pay. You've been insulting a woman who's done nothing but honest work since the day she arrived, which is grounds enough for a hell of a lot worse than that. You've got exactly 1 chance to apologize to Mrs. Whitaker, and after that, whatever happens next is on you." The room held its breath. Boone looked around the table for support and found none. Every man there, even those who'd laughed at Martha's expense 2 weeks earlier, sat silent, unwilling to cross whatever line Caleb had just drawn. Something about the stillness of the room, the way even Otis, who'd wandered in for his own supper, said nothing to contradict Caleb, told Martha there was more to this quiet cowboy than anyone had bothered to explain to her. Boone's jaw worked for a long moment before he finally muttered, "Sorry," in a tone that suggested he meant anything but. "Look at her when you say it," Caleb said. Boone's eyes flicked up to Martha's resentment burning behind them, and he repeated, "Sorry, ma'am," with slightly more sincerity forced into the words, though the sincerity didn't reach far past his teeth. "Apology accepted," Martha said evenly, though she doubted very much that it had been sincere at all. "Now finish your supper or don't. Either way, I've got dishes to see to." She turned back to the stove, and the room slowly returned to its low murmur of conversation, though the air remained charged in a way that told Martha this would not be the last confrontation of its kind. Boone finished his meal in silence, and left without another word, and one by one, the other hands filed out after him, until only Caleb remained sitting at the table watching Martha scrub the pots with more force than the task strictly required. "You didn't have to do that either," she said without turning around. "I know," Caleb said again. "You keep saying that." "It keeps being true." Martha set down the pot she was scrubbing and finally turned to face him, her hands still damp, her apron stained with the evening's work. "Why do you care what happens to me, Mr. Rowan? You've known me 2 weeks. I'm not your responsibility, and I'm not asking to be." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers with an expression that was hard to name, something caught between memory and resolve. "Maybe I've got my reasons," he said finally. "Maybe someday I'll tell you what they are. For now, just know that a man doesn't have to have known somebody long to recognize when they're worth standing up for." He rose from the table before she could press him further, tipped his hat, as he always did, and left her alone in the cookhouse with the dying fire and her racing thoughts, wondering what reasons a man like Caleb Rowan could possibly have for defending a cook he'd met only weeks before, and wondering, too, why the question troubled her more than she wanted to admit. Winter deepened over the following weeks, burying Red Valley Ranch under drifts that reached the windowsills, forcing the crew into the harder, colder rhythms of a Montana winter breaking ice from troughs, before dawn hauling feed through waist-deep snow-doctoring cattle caught out in blizzards that swept down from the mountains with no warning at all. Martha's kitchen became the one warm refuge on the whole ranch, and slowly, meal by meal, day by day, the resentment that had greeted her arrival began to erode into something closer to respect. Del Hutchins took to sitting near the stove after supper, telling stories of ranches he'd worked in his younger years, and Martha found herself laughing more freely than she had in longer than she could remember. A young hand named Tommy Briggs, barely 17 and homesick in a way he tried hard to hide, began lingering after breakfast to help her with the dishes, admitting one morning through tears he tried to blink away that her biscuits reminded him of his mother's gone 2 years now, to a fever that had taken half his family with her. Martha held his hand across the table that morning and said nothing, because some griefs didn't need words, only company. Even a few of the men who'd laughed hardest that first day began finding small ways to make amends: an extra armful of firewood left by her door, a rabbit skinned and dressed and left on her step for the pot, a murmured word of thanks after a meal that had gotten a hard crew through a harder day. Martha noticed each small kindness and cataloged them carefully, the way she'd once cataloged cruelties, because she had learned that a person survives not by forgetting the bad, but by making room enough for the good to matter more. Only Boone Talley remained sullen and unmoved, though he'd learned after that night at the table to keep his cruelty quieter. Murmured to the few hands who still found his bitterness amusing, careful never to let it reach Caleb's ears again. Martha caught the undercurrent of it still in the way he refused to meet her eyes, in the way his thanks, when forced from him by manners rather than sincerity, always came out clipped and grudging. She did not expect him to change. She had learned long ago that some men's pride was too brittle to survive the admission that they'd been wrong, and she stopped wasting hope on the ones determined to stay small. There came a Sunday near the end of that first month when Otis declared the crew could have the afternoon to themselves, the chores caught up, and the weather calm enough to allow it. Most of the men scattered toward the bunkhouse to sleep or gamble away what little coin they had, but a few gathered near the corral, where Del Hutchins had pulled out a battered fiddle and Tommy Briggs produced a harmonica from somewhere in his coat, and before long, a ragged sort of music drifted across the yard. Martha stood in the cookhouse doorway, drying her hands on her apron, watching the men laugh and stomp their boots in the snow, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel something like ease. Tommy waved her over, grinning wide despite the gap where he'd lost a tooth to a stubborn mule the week before. "Come on, Mrs. Whitaker," he called. "Del says he'll play you a proper reel if you'll dance it." "I haven't danced in longer than you've been alive, Tommy Briggs." "All the more reason," Del said, already sawing the fiddle into a lively tune. "Man forgets how to dance, next thing you know he's forgot how to laugh too. Can't have that happen to a fine cook like yourself." Martha laughed, despite herself, waving off the invitation. Though she stepped closer to the fire barrel, the men had lit against the cold, and let the music work its way into her tired bones. It was Caleb standing near the edge of the gathering, with his hat pushed back and his hands in his pockets, who caught her eye across the fire, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Red Valley Ranch, Martha saw him smile. Not the faint shadow of something close to a smile that she'd grown used to, but a real smile, brief and unguarded, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "You dance, Mr. Rowan?" she asked when he'd made his way around the fire to stand near her. "Used to," he said. "Long time ago." "What happened?" "Ran out of reasons to." He looked at her sideways, something careful in the look, as though he were testing whether the words might invite a question he wasn't ready to answer. "Might be I'm finding a few again." Martha didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all, and the two of them stood together near the fire while Del's fiddle wound its way through an old reel and Tommy Briggs stomped through the snow with more enthusiasm than skill, and for that one golden hour Red Valley Ranch felt less like a place of hard labor and more like something close to a family patched together from strangers who'd found almost by accident that they fit. The moment didn't last, of course. Moments like that rarely do. Boone Tally watched from the shadow of the bunkhouse porch, arms crossed, jaw tight. And when Martha caught his eye across the fire, she saw something there that chilled her, more than the wind. Not simple resentment anymore, but something calculating, something patient. The look of a man deciding how and when to even a score he believed was owed him. She looked away, first telling herself it was nothing that Boone's pride would cool as the winter wore on, the way pride so often did when a man had nowhere else to spend it. She would remember that look later and wish she'd trusted it sooner. The days grew shorter and the nights grew longer, and Martha settled into the rhythm of the ranch, the way a stone settles into a riverbed, worn smooth by the current, until it seemed to belong there. She learned each man's preferences, without being told that Dell liked his coffee bitter enough to strip paint, that Tommy needed an extra biscuit tucked into his coat pocket most mornings, because he was still growing and always hungry. That even Boone, for all his sourness, could be coaxed into something like civility, with a slice of dried apple pie. Though she rationed such kindness carefully, unwilling to let generosity be mistaken for forgiveness he hadn't earned. She learned, too, the particular quiet of Caleb Rowan, the way he took his coffee black and drank it slow, savoring it like a man who'd once gone without such small comforts and never forgot the taste of scarcity. She learned that he read by lamplight long after the other hands had gone to sleep. A worn leather book she never saw the title of, and that he wrote letters some evenings, sealing them himself and riding into town to post them, rather than leaving them for the ranch's regular mail run, as though the contents were too important to risk in ordinary hands. She learned that he watched the horizon most mornings before anyone else stirred, standing alone at the edge of the yard, with his coffee cooling in his hand, looking out over the snow-buried land, with an expression that was neither pride nor worry, but some complicated mixture of both. The look of a man carrying a weight nobody else on that ranch seemed to notice. "You look at this land like it owes you something," Martha said to him once, finding him there in the gray hour before dawn, her own hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she'd brought out to share, though she hadn't quite admitted to herself why she'd bothered. "Not owes me," Caleb said, not turning from the horizon. "Reckon it's more like I owe it. Man inherits something built by somebody else's sweat, seems only fair he spends the rest of his life making sure it was worth the cost." That's a strange way for a ranch hand to talk about a job. Caleb was quiet a long moment, and Martha thought, not for the first time, that she'd pressed too close to whatever line he kept drawn around himself. But then he turned, and there was something almost like relief in his face. The look of a man who wanted badly to say more than he allowed himself to. "Maybe I ain't just a ranch hand," he said. "Maybe someday I'll tell you the whole of it. For now, just know I've got reasons for staying quiet that got nothing to do with shame, and everything to do with wanting to be judged for the man I am, not the things I was born into." That's an awful lot of mystery for a man who spends his days mucking stalls same as everybody else. "Man's allowed a mystery or two," Caleb said, and the ghost of that rare smile touched his mouth again. "Keeps life interesting." He walked off toward the barn before she could press further, and Martha stood alone in the cold morning light, turning his words over in her mind, feeling the shape of some larger truth just beyond her reach, patient and waiting. The way she imagined a buried spring waits beneath winter ground for the thaw that will finally let it rise. Caleb, meanwhile, remained a puzzle Martha found herself turning over more often than she meant to. He worked harder than any man on the ranch up before most of the crew, and often still in the barn, long after the others had turned in. Yet he never spoke of ambition, never complained of exhaustion, never seemed to want anything beyond the simple satisfaction of work done well. He ate at the same table as the other hands, slept in the same bunkhouse, wore the same patched coat through the coldest months. And yet there was something in the way Otis deferred to him in small moments, something in the way even the oldest hands seemed to look to him for a kind of quiet approval, that told Martha there was more to Caleb Rowan than a ranch hand's wages could explain. She asked Dell about it once over coffee on a slow afternoon, while the wind howled outside and the crew waited out a storm too fierce for outdoor work. Caleb's always been like that, Dell said, cradling his cup in both hands. Quiet, watchful, works harder than any 3 men put together and never asks for credit. Been here longer than I have, and that's saying something since I've been here going on 8 years. He seem odd to you, the way the others treat him, I mean. Like he's more than just another hand. Dell's eyes flicked toward the window toward the yard where Caleb could be seen through the swirling snow checking on a horse in the near paddock despite the storm. Some things ain't mine to say, Mrs. Whitaker. Caleb's a good man. Best I've known, truth told. Whatever else there is to know about him, I figure he'll tell you himself when he's ready, and not a moment before. Martha did not press further, though the mystery lodged itself somewhere in the back of her mind, resurfacing in quiet moments when Caleb settled a dispute between 2 hands with a word where Otis would have needed 10, when he seemed to know things about the ranch's finances and future plans that no ordinary cowboy had reason to know when the bank's agent came through on ranch business one bitter afternoon and spoke to Caleb in the barn for the better part of an hour. Low voices carrying just far enough for Martha to hear urgency without hearing words. She did not ask him about it directly. She told herself it was none of her business that she'd been hired to cook and clean, and not to pry into the private affairs of men who owed her nothing beyond a fair wage and a roof over her head. But some nights, lying awake in the small back room of the cookhouse, listening to the wind claw at the walls, she found herself thinking of Caleb's steady eyes, and quieter than others, and wondering what secret sat behind them, patient and waiting. The weeks rolled on toward the deep heart of winter, and Martha's place on the ranch solidified into something she hadn't quite dared to hope for, when she'd first walked through that gate with nothing but an old bag and a stubborn refusal to be turned away. The cookhouse, once a ruin, now stood as the beating heart of Red Valley Ranch, and Martha Whitaker, once dismissed as nothing more than an unwanted burden, dumped on the doorstep of desperate men, had become something the whole crew had quietly, grudgingly, and then wholeheartedly come to depend on. But dependence was not the same as belonging, and Martha knew better than to mistake the two. She had been fed on false belonging before, in another town, another kitchen, another set of hands that had seemed kind, until the moment they weren't. She kept a careful distance in her own heart, even as her hands gave everything she had to the work in front of her, because trust, she had learned, was a debt that had to be earned slowly in small, honest coins, and never all at once. There was a night in the deepest stretch of January when the temperature dropped so low that even the cattle huddled shoulder to shoulder in the lee of the barn, and Otis sent every hand out into the dark to make certain none had strayed toward the frozen creek where the ice could not be trusted. Martha kept the cookhouse fire roaring and coffee always hot, ladling out cups to men who stumbled in half-frozen every hour or so to warm their hands before heading back out into the black and biting cold. It was near midnight when Tommy Briggs burst through the door breathless, his face white with something more than cold. "It's Caleb," he gasped. "His horse went down in a drift out past the north fence. He's hurt bad. I think Dell's gone for him, but I don't know." Martha didn't think. She grabbed her coat, her lantern, and a bundle of blankets from the shelf by the door before Tommy had even finished his sentence, and was out into the screaming wind before anyone could tell her to stay behind where it was safe. The snow came sideways, stinging her face raw, and the cold bit through her coat like teeth, but she pushed on toward the flickering light of Dell's lantern in the distance, praying with every step that she would not be too late. She found them in a shallow gully, where the wind had carved the snow into a deceptive drift. Caleb's horse struggling to rise on a leg that clearly would not hold it, and Caleb himself pinned partway beneath the animal, his face pale, a gash along his temple bleeding freely into the snow. Dell was working to free the horse, cursing under his breath, and it took both Martha and Dell together hauling with everything they had to finally get the frightened animal up and away so Caleb could crawl free. "Can you stand?" Martha shouted over the wind, dropping to her knees beside him, pressing a fold of blanket hard against the wound at his temple. "Reckon I'll have to," Caleb said through gritted teeth, though his voice was thinner than she'd ever heard it, and when he tried to put weight on his leg, he went white and nearly buckled. "Ankle's twisted, maybe worse," Dell said, examining it quickly with the practiced hands of a man who'd broken his share of bones over the years. We need to get him inside before this wind takes what's left of him." Between the two of them, they got Caleb up, and moving his arm, slung across Martha's shoulders. His weight heavier than she'd expected, though she did not let herself falter beneath it. Not once. Not through the entire agonizing half-mile back to the cookhouse with the wind trying to tear them apart at every step. By the time they got him through the door and into a chair by the fire, Martha's arms shook with exhaustion and cold, but her hands were steady as she cleaned the gash on his head and wrapped his ankle tight with strips of clean cloth. "You didn't have to come out there yourself," Caleb said, watching her work by the firelight. His voice rough with pain, he was trying hard not to show. "Funny," Martha said, not looking up from the bandage. "Seems to me I've heard you say something just like that to me once or twice before." The ghost of a laugh escaped him quickly, swallowed by a wince as she tightened the wrap. "Reckon we're a matched pair then. Neither one of us knowing how to leave well enough alone when somebody needs help." "Reckon we are," Martha said quietly, and something passed between them in that firelit room, unspoken but unmistakable. A recognition of two people who had each spent years taking care of everyone but themselves, finding in each other for the first time someone willing to do the same in return. She sat with him long after Dell had gone to fetch dry blankets, feeding the fire, watching the color slowly return to his face, and when at last his breathing eased into something like rest, she allowed herself just for a moment to reach out and brush the hair back from the wound at his temple, gentle as she would have been with a child, though the feeling rising in her chest was nothing so simple as that. It was a full week before Caleb could walk without a limp. A week during which Martha found reasons to bring him coffee more often than strictly necessary, and Caleb found reasons to linger in the cookhouse longer than his healing ankle required, and neither of them spoke aloud of what had passed between them that night in the firelight, though both of them carried it quiet and warm into every conversation that followed. It was on one of the coldest nights of that long winter, not long after Caleb had finally shed his crutch with the wind screaming across the valley and snow piled higher than she'd ever seen it, that Wade Mercer arrived at Red Valley Ranch, hired on as temporary help to see the crew through calving season. A stranger with an easy smile and eyes that lingered too long on things that weren't his to look at. Martha felt the wrongness of him the moment he walked into her cookhouse, shaking snow from his hat, grinning at her in a way that made the hair on her arms rise even before he said a single word. "Well now," Wade said, looking her over the same way the men had that first day in the yard, though there was something colder in his gaze than there had been in theirs, something that made Martha's stomach turn in a way mere insult never had. "Ain't you a sight for a cold night? Heard the cooking here was good. Didn't hear the cook was quite so—" He let the word hang, smiling wider. "Substantial." Martha did not answer him. She set his plate down harder than necessary and turned back to the stove, and something in her instinct honed by years of learning which men were merely thoughtless, and which men were something worse, told her to keep her back to the wall whenever Wade Mercer was in the room. Dell noticed it too. He caught Martha's eye across the table that first night and gave her the faintest shake of his head. A warning passed silent between two people who'd both seen enough of the world to recognize a wolf dressed up in a hired hand's coat. "Watch yourself around that one," Dell murmured later when he lingered to help her clear the dishes, though it wasn't his job to do so. "Man like that, all smile and no substance, he's trouble looking for a place to happen. I've met his kind before," Martha said, scrubbing harder than the pot required. "That so?" "More than once." She didn't offer more, and Dell, wise enough not to press a wound he could sense, but not see, only nodded, and carried the stack of plates to the shelf without another word. Wade Mercer, for his part, seemed entirely unbothered by the cold reception he'd received from most of the crew. He worked well enough, Martha had to admit, competent with the calving, and easy enough with the horses, and he had a way of laughing loud, and often that won over a few of the younger hands, who mistook volume for charm. But he watched Martha in a way that made her skin crawl, even from across the yard, a lingering, assessing gaze that reminded her of doors she'd thought long since closed, and every instinct she owned told her that Wade Mercer was a man who had never once in his life heard the word no and taken it for an answer. "You're new to feeling unwelcome, ain't you?" he said to her one evening, cornering her near the woodpile as she gathered an armful of split logs for the stove, his tone light, almost teasing, though there was nothing light in the way he'd positioned himself between her and the open yard. "Whole ranch treats you like you're something special. Can't say I understand it myself. Seen plenty of cooks in my time. Seen plenty of women too, come to that. Never seen much reason for anybody to make such a fuss over one built like you. I'd be obliged if you'd let me pass, Mr. Mercer." "Now don't go getting prickly," Wade said, though he didn't move. "I'm only saying what everybody else is thinking and too polite to say out loud. Reckon you ought to be grateful somebody's willing to be honest with you." "I've had my fill of men who confuse cruelty with honesty," Martha said, and this time she stepped forward with enough resolve that he had no choice but to give ground or let their shoulders collide, and something in her level, unflinching gaze made him step aside after all. Though the smile he wore as she passed did not reach anywhere near his eyes. She told no one about that exchange, not even Caleb, though she found herself in the days that followed arranging her chores so that she was rarely alone in the yard when Wade Mercer was near and keeping the kitchen knife she used for dressing meat within easier reach than she had before, tucked at her hip beneath her apron where her hand could find it without thinking. She had learned long before Montana that a woman's safety was never guaranteed by good behavior alone, only by her own vigilance, and she was not about to let herself grow careless simply because most of Red Valley Ranch had finally begun to treat her with something like respect. She would be right to trust that instinct, though it would take one more terrible night before the whole ranch understood exactly how right she'd been, and before the truth of who Caleb Rowan really was would come crashing down over Red Valley Ranch like the spring thaw breaking a frozen river all at once. For now, Martha banked the fire wiped down the table and walked to her small room in the back of the cookhouse, unaware that the quiet cowboy who'd been watching over her since the day she arrived was about to become the only thing standing between her and a danger she hadn't yet learned to name. Martha did not sleep well after Wade Mercer cornered her by the woodpile, and she woke before the rooster with her jaw already set for the day. The way a woman sets herself before a fight she knows is coming but cannot yet name the hour of. She built the fire, ground the coffee, and told herself the same thing she had told herself in another town, another kitchen a lifetime ago, that a man's leering was not her shame to carry, and that fear only fed what it touched. Wade came in for breakfast, loud and easy, laughing with two of the younger hands about a horse he'd broken the week before, and if Martha hadn't watched his eyes cut toward her twice in the space of a single sentence, she might have believed the whole encounter by the woodpile had been nothing more than a bad dream born of an exhausted mind. But she had not imagined the way he'd blocked her path, and she had not imagined the chill that ran down her spine when he smiled at her now easy as Sunday, as though nothing at all had passed between them. "Morning, Mrs. Whitaker," Wade said, holding out his plate for a second helping of eggs. "That coffee smells like it could raise the dead." "It's meant to wake the living," Martha said, filling his cup without meeting his eyes. "The dead are past helping." A ripple of laughter went around the table, and Wade laughed loudest of all, though something flickered behind his eyes that told Martha he'd heard the edge in her words and filed it away rather than let it pass. She moved on down the table, refilling cups, setting down platters, and did not allow herself to look back at him, even once, though she felt his gaze on her the whole while, patient as a cat at a mouse hole. Caleb watched the exchange from his seat near the end of the table, saying nothing, his eyes moving from Martha's carefully neutral face to Wade's easy smile, and back again the way a man reads weather before deciding whether to bring in the herd. He said nothing through breakfast, but when the crew filed out to start the day's chores, he lingered at the door until Wade had gone, then turned back toward the stove where Martha stood scraping the last of the eggs from the pan. "Everything all right, Mrs. Whitaker?" "Fine," Martha said too quickly, and Caleb's eyes narrowed just slightly the way they did when a man knew he was being handed a smaller truth than the one that mattered. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure, Mr. Rowan." She set the pan down harder than she meant to, the clatter loud in the quiet kitchen. "I've handled worse than an idle cowboy's bad manners before. I'll handle it now." Caleb studied her a long moment, and something in his stillness told her he did not believe the answer she'd given him, though he did not press further, not yet. "You know you can tell me things," he said, instead. Quiet, careful, the words offered like a hand extended, but not forced. Whatever it is, I ain't a man who goes around fixing things nobody asked me to fix, but I am a man who will listen when somebody needs listening to. I know that about you, Mr. Rowan. Martha managed a small, tired smile. It's one of the reasons I trust you more than most men I've met. Just most. I'm still deciding on the rest. That earned her the faintest ghost of his rare smile, and he tipped his hat and left her to her mourning. Though Martha noticed in the days that followed that Caleb seemed to find more reasons than usual to be near the cookhouse. Whenever Wade Mercer was also nearby splitting wood. He didn't need to split mending fences that weren't yet broken, always within earshot, always watching. Though he never once made it seem as though he doubted her ability to handle herself. The days rolled forward under a sky the color of old iron snow, falling in fits and starts. The crew driven by the relentless demands of calving season into longer hours and shorter tempers. Wade Mercer proved himself capable enough with the cattle. Martha had to admit quick with a rope and steady with a nervous heifer, and for a while, it seemed as though the ranch might simply absorb him, the way it absorbed every hard winter, folding his rough edges into the general grind of the season. But Boone Talley, who had never fully surrendered his grudge against Martha, found in Wade a kindred spirit, and the two of them began to drift together in the evenings, murmuring over cards in the corner of the bunkhouse, their laughter carrying an edge that made the older hands uneasy, even when they couldn't say exactly why. Del Hutchins mentioned it to Martha one night while helping her carry water from the well, his breath fogging in the cold. "Tally and that Mercer fellow," Del said. "They're thick as thieves lately. Don't like the look of it." "Boone's never liked me," Martha said. "Wade's cut from similar cloth. Stands to reason they'd find each other." "Stands to reason," Del agreed. "But two men nursing the same grudge together tend to grow braver than either one alone. You watch yourself, Mrs. Whitaker. I mean that plain." "I always do, Del." "I know you do. Don't mean I won't worry anyway." Martha appreciated the old cowboy's concern more than she let on, and she carried his warning with her through the following days, watching Boone and Wade with the same careful vigilance she'd once reserved for storm clouds on the horizon, learning to read the shift in weather before the first drop of rain ever fell. It was on a Thursday, gray and bitter, that the first real trouble surfaced. Martha had sent Tommy Briggs out to the smokehouse to fetch a side of bacon for the evening meal, and the boy came back pale and shaking the meat forgotten in his hands. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, his voice unsteady, "somebody's been in the smokehouse. Half the winter stores are gone. Sacks slid open, meat missing, and somebody's tracked mud clean through where the flour's kept." Martha's stomach dropped. She followed Tommy out into the cold, her breath coming in short, angry clouds, and found the smokehouse exactly as he'd described. Torn sacks missing provisions, the careful order she'd built over the winter, thrown into chaos by careless or deliberate hands. It would take days to sort out what was salvageable, and worse, it meant stretching what remained further than she'd planned at the worst possible point in a hard winter. Otis came to investigate within the hour, his face grim as he surveyed the damage. "Coyotes, maybe," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Or somebody careless with the latch." "This wasn't coyotes," Martha said, kneeling to examine a boot print pressed clear into a spill of flour near the door. Half again, too large for any animal, and unmistakably a man's heel. And it wasn't carelessness either. Somebody wanted this to look like an accident. Otis crouched beside her, studying the print, his jaw tightening. "You gotta guess who—" Martha thought of Boone's sullen resentment and Wade's calculating smile, and she thought too of how convenient it would be for either of them to see her fail at the one thing that had earned her a place on this ranch. "I've got more than a guess," she said. "But I've got no proof, and accusing a man without proof only makes an enemy of someone who might otherwise have stayed a coward in the shadows." "Wise," Otis said, straightening. "But I'll be watching close from here on. This ranch don't tolerate sabotage, whoever's behind it." Word of the break-in spread through the crew by supper time, and Martha watched carefully as she served the meal, noting who seemed surprised and who seemed merely curious, who asked questions, and who stayed conspicuously silent. Boone ate with his eyes fixed on his plate, offering no comment at all, which struck Martha as far more telling than any denial could have been. Wade, by contrast, made a great show of outrage, loudly speculating about drifters and thieves, passing through his indignation so theatrical that Martha found herself more suspicious of him for it, not less. Caleb said nothing through the meal, but Martha caught him watching Boone with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Something cold and assessing that made even the older hands fall quiet when they noticed it. After supper, he lingered by the door as the others filed out, and when only Martha remained, he spoke low enough that no one else could hear. "I aim to find out who did this," he said. "Otis is already looking into it. I know. I intend to look harder." Something in his voice carried a weight that surprised her, an authority that went beyond what any ordinary ranch hand should possess. "Nobody sabotages this ranch's stores and gets away clean. Not while I've got breath in me." "That's an awful strong claim for a man who mucks stalls same as everybody else," Martha said, echoing words she'd used before testing him gently. Caleb's eyes met hers, steady, unflinching. "Maybe it's time you stopped wondering about that and started trusting that whatever I am, I mean you no harm and every good I can offer." "I already trust that, Mr. Rowan." "Then trust this too. Whoever did this will answer for it." He left before she could ask him how he intended to make good on such a promise. And Martha stood alone in the empty cookhouse, feeling the weight of his words settle over her like a blanket against the cold, comforting and unsettling in equal measure. The days that followed brought no confession and no further proof. Though Martha noticed Boone growing quieter, more watchful, casting glances toward Caleb whenever their paths crossed that carried something close to fear. Whatever conversation had passed between the two men, she never learned the details, but Boone's swagger dimmed considerably, and he took to avoiding Caleb's company altogether, a change that did not go unnoticed by the rest of the crew. Wade, meanwhile, seemed entirely unbothered by the suspicion hanging over the bunkhouse, continuing his work with the same easy confidence as before, though his attention toward Martha grew bolder rather than more cautious, as though the general chaos of the break-in had convinced him the ranch's order was fraying enough to excuse whatever liberties he chose to take. It happened on a Tuesday evening, nearly 2 weeks after the theft, when Martha found herself alone in the smokehouse well after dark, salvaging what she could from the last of the damaged stores by lantern light. She heard the door creak behind her and turned, expecting Tommy or Dell, and found instead Wade Mercer filling the doorway, his hat pushed back, a bottle loose in one hand. "Evening, Mrs. Whitaker." He said his words slightly slurred, his smile wider and looser than usual. "Awful late for a woman to be out here alone." "I'm nearly finished," Martha said, keeping her voice level, though every instinct in her body had gone taut as a drawn bowstring. "You'll want to head back to the bunkhouse, Mr. Mercer. It's cold out, and you've clearly had enough to drink." "I've had exactly enough," Wade said, stepping further into the smokehouse, letting the door swing shut behind him. "To finally say what I've been thinking since the day I got here." He took another step, and Martha's hand drifted toward the knife at her hip, tucked where it had been since the night by the woodpile. "You think you're something special on this ranch. Cook of the year, everybody's darling. But I seen women like you before, all high and mighty, 'cause a few lonely cowboys are too polite to say what they really think." "Step back, Mr. Mercer." "Or what?" His smile turned into something uglier, and he closed another step of distance, close enough now that Martha could smell the whiskey thick on his breath. "You gonna cry to Rowan? Gonna hide behind his coattails like some scared little—" Martha's hand found the knife before he finished the sentence, and she raised it between them, her grip steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I said step back." Wade's eyes flicked to the blade, and something in his drunken confidence faltered just slightly, though he did not retreat as far as she'd hoped. "Easy now," he said, holding up his free hand, though his tone still carried mockery rather than fear. "No need for that. I'm just talking. You've said your piece. Now you'll leave, or I'll make certain Otis hears every word of what you've said tonight, and you can explain to him why a man twice my size felt the need to corner an unarmed woman in a dark smokehouse." Something in her voice, steady and cold, as the winter outside, seemed finally to reach him, and Wade took a slow step backward, his hands raised in mock surrender. "No harm done," he said, though his eyes still carried that same unsettling hunger. "Just a friendly conversation. Get out." He left, finally stumbling slightly as he pushed through the door into the night, and Martha stood alone in the smokehouse for a long moment afterward, her hands shaking now that the danger had passed, the knife still gripped tight in her fist. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a currency she could not afford to spend on men who did not deserve the weight of her feeling. But she allowed herself just for a moment to lean against the shelf and breathe slow and deliberate until the shaking eased. She told no one about the encounter that night, though she began locking the smokehouse door behind her whenever she worked there after dark, and she made certain never again to be caught alone in any corner of the ranch without a clear path to open ground. She told herself this was simply prudence, the same careful vigilance she'd carried since the day she arrived, but some deeper part of her recognized the encounter for what it truly was. A warning shot, a taste of worse to come. And she began to understand with a clarity that chilled her more than the winter wind that Wade Mercer was not a man who learned lessons easily, nor one who accepted a single refusal as final. The next morning, Caleb noticed something different in her before she'd said a single word. He found her at the stove, her movements slightly stiffer than usual, her eyes shadowed from a night of restless half-sleep, and though she offered him the same steady greeting she gave every morning, he did not accept it at face value. "Something happened," he said, not a question. "Nothing worth troubling you with, Martha." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the weight of it stopped her mid-motion spoon suspended over the pan. "Whatever it is you can tell me. I ain't going to think less of you for needing help, and I ain't going to make you regret trusting me with it." She looked at him a long moment, weighing the cost of silence against the cost of confession, and finally haltingly, she told him what had happened in the smokehouse, watching his face darken with each word, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out sharp beneath his weathered skin. "He put his hands on you." "No. He came close. Close enough." Martha's voice remained steady, even as the memory tightened something cold in her chest. "I handled it, Caleb. I want you to understand that. I didn't need rescuing." "I know you didn't." Caleb's voice had gone quiet, dangerous, in a way she hadn't heard from him before. A stillness that reminded her suddenly and sharply of the way a rattlesnake goes silent just before it strikes. "That don't mean he gets to walk away from it without answering." "What are you going to do?" "Nothing rash," Caleb said, though something in his eyes suggested restraint was costing him more than he let show. "But I promise you this. Wade Mercer's days on this ranch are numbered, and the number's getting smaller by the hour." He left before she could ask him what exactly he intended, and Martha spent the rest of the morning turning his words over in her mind, wondering again at the authority that ran beneath his quiet manner, an authority that no ordinary hand should have possessed, and yet one that seemed to grow more evident with every passing week. She did not have to wonder long. 2 days later, Otis called Wade Mercer into the ranch house for what the rest of the crew assumed was a routine matter of pay or duties. But Dell, who happened to be passing near the window while mending a bridle, reported afterward that raised voices had carried clear through the glass. Otis's tone harder than anyone had ever heard it, though the words themselves remained too muffled to make out clearly. Wade emerged from that meeting pale and furious, his jaw set tight, and though he said nothing to Martha directly, the look he cast her way as he crossed the yard carried a venom that made her blood run cold despite the relative safety of daylight and witnesses. He did not leave the ranch that day, nor the next, and Martha understood from the careful way Otis avoided her eyes at supper that whatever warning had been delivered had not been sufficient to remove the danger entirely, only to delay it. "Why is he still here?" she asked Caleb that evening, finding him near the barn as the last light drained from the sky. "Calving season's not done," Caleb said, his voice tight with frustration he was clearly working to control. "We're short-handed as it is, and firing a man outright without proof strong enough to hold up if he complains to the county opens the ranch to trouble we can't afford right now. Otis gave him a warning sharp enough to draw blood. Told him one more incident, any incident, and he's gone without pay and without a reference. and Otis'll make certain every ranch in the territory knows why. That's not enough. I know it ain't." Caleb's hands curled into fists at his sides, and for the first time since she'd known him, Martha saw something in his expression that looked less like patience and more like barely restrained violence. "I wanted him gone the moment you told me what happened, but there's ways things have to be done even when every part of me wants to handle it different." "What ways would those be?" Caleb looked at her a long moment, and something in his face told her he was weighing how much to say, how close he dared come to whatever truth he'd been guarding since the day she'd arrived. "The kind of ways a man's got to answer to more than just his own temper," he said, finally cryptic as ever. "Trust me a little longer, Martha. I promise you this ends soon, and it ends in your favor." She did trust him, more than she'd trusted any man in, longer than she cared to admit, though the uncertainty of what exactly he meant gnawed at her. Through the following days, a splinter of curiosity buried beneath layers of more pressing worry. The tension on the ranch thickened like ice over a slow-moving creek, invisible on the surface but treacherous beneath. Wade kept his distance from Martha in the days that followed his meeting with Otis, though she caught him watching her still from across the yard from the shadow of the barn, his eyes carrying a patience that unsettled her more than open aggression ever could have. Boone, for his part, seemed to have withdrawn entirely from whatever alliance he'd formed with Wade, keeping to himself, eating quickly, and leaving the table before conversation could catch him in its net. It was Tommy Briggs of all people who brought Martha the piece of information that finally cracked the mystery of the smokehouse theft wide open. The boy came to her one evening twisting his hat in his hands, his young face torn between loyalty and conscience. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "I got to tell you something, and I'm awful scared to say it, but I can't keep carrying it around no more." "Whatever it is, Tommy, you can tell me." "It was Boone," Tommy said in a rush, the words tumbling out before his courage could fail him. "I seen him that night sneaking out to the smokehouse with a sack. Didn't think nothing of it at first, figured he was just fetching something for his own supper. But then the theft come to light the next morning, and I put it together, and I've been sick about it ever since, not knowing whether to say something or keep quiet." Martha felt something cold settle in her chest, confirmation of a suspicion she'd carried for weeks, but had lacked the proof to act upon. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "I was scared." Tommy admitted, his voice small. "Boone's mean when he's crossed, and I didn't want to be the one who crossed him. But it ain't right, him letting the blame sit on nobody in particular while the whole ranch wonders and worries. It ain't right, and I couldn't stomach it no more." "You did right telling me, Tommy. That took courage." Martha put a hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling him relax slightly beneath the gesture. "I'll see that this gets handled properly. You won't have to face Boone alone in this." She took the information to Otis that same evening, and though Tommy's testimony alone might not have been enough to force a confession, the confrontation that followed with Otis, laying out the accusation plainly and watching Boone's face for the telltale signs of guilt, proved sufficient. Boone broke within minutes, admitting to the theft in a torrent of self-justifying excuses about wanting to see the fat cook fail, about resenting a woman who'd humiliated him in front of the whole crew, about believing the ranch would be better off without her interference in what he considered rightfully a man's domain. Otis fired him on the spot, no severance, no reference, sending him off into the cold with nothing but his own bitterness for company. Martha watched from the cookhouse window as Boone rode away from Red Valley Ranch for the last time, and found to her own surprise that she felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a tired relief that the uncertainty was finally resolved. "You did that," Caleb said, finding her at the window afterward. "Your patience, your refusal to accuse without proof. That's what brought this to a fair end, instead of an ugly one." "Tommy did the hard part. All I did was listen." "Listening's harder than most folks think," Caleb said. "Especially when the truth costs somebody you might have been tempted to protect out of simple mercy." Martha turned to look at him, something in his words carrying more weight than the moment strictly required. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "Maybe I am." His eyes held hers a moment longer than comfortable, and then he looked away out toward the empty road where Boone's tracks were already filling with fresh snow. "There's things I ain't told you yet, Martha. Things that matter more than I've let on. I mean to tell you when the time's right. Just Not yet. Why not now? Because some truths told too soon do more harm than good. He turned back to her, and the tenderness in his expression caught her off guard, unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him before. I need you to trust me a little longer. Can you do that? I've trusted you this far, Martha said quietly. I don't see much reason to stop now. Something passed between them in that moment, warm and fragile, as the first thaw of spring, and Caleb reached out briefly to touch her hand, where it rested on the windowsill. A gesture so simple and so unexpected that Martha felt her breath catch in her throat. He withdrew his hand almost immediately, as though surprised by his own boldness, and cleared his throat, stepping back with the careful discipline of a man unwilling to overstep a line he'd only just discovered he wanted to cross. I should get back to the horses, he said, though he made no immediate move to leave. You should, Martha agreed, though she made no move to send him away either. They stood together a moment longer in the fading light, the space between them charged with everything neither of them had yet found the courage to say, before Caleb finally tipped his hat and walked off toward the barn, leaving Martha alone with her thoughts and the particular warmth that lingered where his hand had touched hers. With Boone gone, the ranch settled into an uneasy but improved rhythm. The crew united in relief at the resolution of the theft, if not entirely certain what to make of Wade Mercer's continued brooding presence among them. Martha noticed that Wade had grown quieter since Boone's dismissal, his easy laughter replaced by a watchfulness that reminded her of a coyote circling a wounded animal patient, calculating waiting for the right moment to strike. A hard storm rolled down from the mountains 3 days after Boone's departure, burying the ranch under nearly 2 feet of fresh snow within a single night. And by morning, word came that a dozen head of cattle had strayed beyond the north fence before the storm hit, trapped now somewhere in the drifts with no shelter and no clear path back to safety. Otis called every able hand to the search, and Martha, though her duties kept her tied to the cookhouse, found herself pressed into service, preparing food and hot drink to be carried out to the men working the bitter cold, her hands raw from the effort of keeping enough coffee brewing to warm a dozen freezing cowboys through a day that stretched far longer than anyone had anticipated. By mid-afternoon, word came back that 3 calves had been found, nearly frozen, too weak to walk, and Martha did not hesitate before bundling every spare blanket she owned into a sack and following Tommy Briggs out into the white wilderness herself, unwilling to leave the rescue of helpless creatures to men already exhausted from hours in the cold. She found Caleb kneeling in the snow beside one of the calves, rubbing its trembling flank with rough, urgent hands, his own face chapped raw by the wind. And without a word she knelt beside him, wrapping the shivering animal in the blankets she'd carried, working alongside him with a wordless efficiency born of shared purpose. You didn't have to come out here, Caleb said, not looking up from his work. An echo of words they'd exchanged so many times before that they'd become a kind of private language between them. Neither did you most days, Martha said, tucking the blanket tighter around the calf's thin frame. Seems we're both fools for creatures who can't ask for help themselves. Reckon that's the best kind of fool to be. They worked together through the fading light, hauling the weakest calves back toward the barn on a makeshift sledge Dell had fashioned from old fence boards, and by the time the last animal was settled safely into a warmed stall, both Martha and Caleb were soaked through with melted snow and trembling with cold and exhaustion in equal measure. Otis declared the rescue a success, all 12 head accounted for, though the cost had been a full day's labor and nerves stretched thin as old rope. That night, after the crew had eaten and retired exhausted to their bunks, Martha found Caleb still in the barn, checking on the recovering calves by lantern light, his movements slow with a tiredness that went beyond the physical. You should be resting, she told him, setting down a cup of hot coffee within his reach. Couldn't sleep if I tried, Caleb admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. Too much on my mind these days. Wade Mercer. Partly. He was quiet a moment, staring into the steam rising from his cup. Mostly other things. Things I've been carrying a long while now, and things I know I can't carry alone much longer, not if I want to do right by the people who deserve better from me than half-truths and careful silences. Martha sat down on an overturned bucket near him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from the lantern between them. You keep speaking in riddles, Caleb Rowan. One of these days you're going to have to speak plain. One of these days is coming faster than you think, he said, and something in the way he looked at her, then steady and searching, made her breath catch in a way she hadn't expected. I just hope when it comes, you'll still look at me the way you're looking at me right now. And how am I looking at you? Like a man worth trusting, Caleb said quietly. I aim to keep deserving that look, Martha, whatever else comes to light. She did not have to wait long to understand the shape of that moment. It came on a night in early February. The crew gathered for supper after a brutal day spent digging cattle out of a drift that had nearly claimed 2 calves before Caleb and Dell managed to haul them free. The mood at the table was subdued, exhausted, the kind of quiet that settles over men who have spent the day fighting weather and losing more often than winning. Martha moved among them with the coffee pot offering what comfort she could through hot food and warm drink, when Wade Mercer, 3 drinks past sober, despite the ranch's rules, rose unsteadily from his seat and blocked her path between the stove and the table. You know, he said loud enough for the whole room to hear his words slurred, but his intent unmistakable. I've been thinking about you a lot, Mrs. Whitaker. Thinking about how a woman like you ended up somewhere like this, cooking for men who barely tolerate the sight of you. Sit down, Mr. Mercer. Martha's voice was calm, but her whole body had gone rigid with the same instinct that had saved her in the smokehouse weeks before. I ain't finished talking. Wade's hand shot out and closed around her wrist hard enough that Martha gasped, despite herself hard enough to bruise. See, I figure a woman built like you don't get many offers. Figure you ought to be grateful when a man takes an interest, instead of acting like you're too good for the likes of... Let go of her. Caleb's voice cut through the room like a blade, and every man at the table went still. Forks frozen halfway to mouths. Breath held collectively, as though the whole cookhouse had suddenly become a held silence waiting to shatter. Wade's grip did not loosen. If anything, he tightened it, some drunken defiance flaring in his eyes as he turned to face Caleb across the room. This ain't your business, Rowan. I'm making it my business. Caleb rose from his seat, slow and deliberate, every line of his body coiled with a controlled fury that Martha had never witnessed from him, before something ancient and dangerous beneath the quiet surface he'd worn since the day she arrived. Last chance. Let go of her, or I'll make you let go, and you won't much care for the method I choose. For a moment, Wade seemed to consider testing that threat, his jaw working his grip on Martha's wrist, tightening painfully, as though daring Caleb to make good on his word. Then Caleb closed the distance between them in 3 strides faster than a man his size had any right to move, and his hand closed around Wade's wrist with a grip that made the drunk man cry out and release Martha, instantly staggering backward as Caleb twisted his arm just short of breaking it. You put your hands on a woman who never gave you leave to touch her, Caleb said, his voice low and cold as the winter outside. In front of a room full of witnesses on a ranch where every man here has watched her work herself half to death feeding you through the hardest winter this valley's seen in years. You're done, Mercer. Pack your things tonight. You'll be off this land by morning, and if I ever hear you've come within 10 miles of Mrs. Whitaker again, I'll finish what I started here tonight, and there won't be a court in this territory that convicts me for it. Wade cradled his wrist, his face twisted with pain and humiliation, casting one last venomous look around the silent room before stumbling toward the door. This ain't over, Rowan, he spat. It's over the second you're off this property, Caleb said. Make sure you understand that clear. Wade left without another word, slamming the door behind him hard enough to rattle the windows, and the room exhaled as one, the tension breaking into a low murmur of relief and disbelief. Martha stood frozen for a moment, her wrist throbbing where Wade's fingers had dug in, and then Caleb was beside her, his anger dissolving instantly into gentle concern as he took her hand carefully in his, examining the reddening marks with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the violence he'd just displayed. Are you hurt? I'll bruise. Martha said, her voice unsteady now that the immediate danger had passed, the shock of the encounter finally catching up with her. But I'll live. Thank you, Caleb. You don't need to thank me for doing what any decent man would have done. Not every man on this ranch is decent, Martha said quietly. You prove tonight you're one of the few who is. Caleb held her gaze a long moment, something unspoken passing between them that neither dared voice aloud in front of the watching crew. And then he released her hand gently, though the warmth of his touch lingered against her skin long after he'd stepped back. Get some rest, he said. I'll see to it. Mercer's truly gone before morning. He was as good as his word. By dawn, Wade Mercer had ridden out his belongings loaded haphazardly onto a borrowed mule, his departure witnessed by no one but Caleb, who stood at the gate until the last trace of the man had vanished into the gray morning light. When he returned to the cookhouse, he found Martha already awake, already cooking, her wrist wrapped in a strip of cloth she'd tied herself, her composure restored, though something in her eyes carried the weight of the previous night's fear. He's gone, Caleb said simply. For good. For good. I made certain he understood the consequences of ever showing his face on this land again. He paused, studying her carefully. How are you feeling this morning? Tired, Martha admitted. But safe. Safer than I've felt in a long while, if I'm honest. You'll always be safe here, Caleb said, and something in the certainty of his tone, the quiet authority that had grown more evident with every week she'd spent on the ranch, made Martha finally voice the question she'd been circling for weeks. Caleb, who are you really? I've watched Otis defer to you in ways that make no sense for a ranch hand. I've watched you settle disputes and hand down punishments that should belong to a foreman or an owner, not a man who mucks stalls same as everybody else. I think it's time you told me the truth. Caleb was quiet for the long moment, his eyes moving toward the window, toward the vast white expanse of the ranch, stretching out beneath the pale morning sky. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard from him before, the sound of a man finally setting down a burden he'd carried too long alone. Soon, he said. I promise you, Martha, soon you'll know everything. But not this morning. This morning I think you've earned a quiet breakfast, and a day free of secrets and danger both. He managed a small, tired smile. The rest can wait until the whole crew's gathered. What I have to tell you, I think deserves to be told to everyone at once. That sounds ominous. It ain't meant to be, just complicated. He tipped his hat, the familiar gesture that had come to mean more to her than she cared to admit, and turned toward the door. Give me a few more days, Martha. I promise when I tell you, you'll understand why I kept it quiet this long. He left her standing in the cookhouse, with more questions than she'd started the morning, with the mystery of Caleb Rowan deepening even as the danger of Wade Mercer finally lifted from her shoulders. She turned back to the stove, her wrist still tender beneath its wrapping, and found herself, despite everything, smiling faintly at the strange, quiet man who had twice now stood between her and harm, without ever once asking anything in return. The days that followed carried a fragile, unfamiliar peace across Red Valley Ranch, the crew settling into a rhythm undisturbed by cruelty or sabotage for the first time since Martha's arrival. Del Hutchins took to whistling while he worked a habit Martha hadn't heard from him since before the theft had cast its shadow over the bunkhouse, and Tommy Briggs, relieved of the secret he'd carried so long, seemed to grow an inch taller. Overnight, his laughter easier, his manner lighter. Even the hands who had once mocked Martha's arrival now greeted her with genuine warmth, thanking her for meals with sincerity, rather than grudging necessity, offering small kindnesses that no longer felt like debts being paid, but like simple decency finally allowed to flourish. Martha found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, beginning to believe that she had found not merely employment, but something closer to belonging. A place where her worth was measured by her work and her character, rather than the shape of her body or the cruelty of strangers. And yet, beneath that fragile peace, the mystery of Caleb Rowan continued to grow each day, bringing some small new clue that Martha filed away without yet understanding its full shape. She noticed Otis consulting him over ledgers in the evening, their voices low, their expressions serious in a way that suggested matters far beyond the daily business of ranch hands. She noticed a letter arrive for Caleb, bearing an official-looking seal, which he read alone in the barn and did not mention to anyone. She noticed most tellingly of all the way the bank's agent on his next visit to the ranch addressed Caleb not as a hand, but as though seeking his direct approval on matters of considerable weight. "You've noticed it too," Dell said one evening, finding Martha watching through the cookhouse window as Caleb spoke with the agent near the barn, their conversation too distant to overhear, but clearly weighted with importance. "The way things don't quite add up about him." "I have," Martha admitted. "He's promised to tell me everything soon. Gathered the whole crew," he said. Dell's weathered face creased into something that might have been amusement, might have been relief, might have been simple satisfaction at watching a long-kept secret finally near its unveiling. "Reckon that day's coming faster than you might think, Mrs. Whitaker. Man like Caleb don't make promises he don't intend to keep, and he don't gather a whole crew together for matters of small importance." "You know what he's going to say. I got my suspicions," Dell said carefully. "Same as anybody who's worked this ranch as long as I have, but it ain't my place to spoil what he's got planned. Just trust me when I say whatever he tells you, it changes nothing about the man himself. He's the same Caleb Rowan you've come to know these past weeks, whether the truth adds a title to his name or not." "A title?" Martha repeated slowly, turning the words over. "That's an odd thing to say about a ranch hand, Dell Hutchins." Dell's eyes crinkled at the corners, though he offered nothing further, only a small shake of his head, the same careful discretion she'd come to expect whenever the subject of Caleb's true position arose. "Ask me again after tonight's gathering, and maybe I'll have more to say. For now, best you hear it from the man himself." She pressed no further, though the exchange left her more certain than ever that whatever truth Caleb carried, it reached far beyond the ordinary business of a hired hand. She thought of the letter, with its official seal of the bank agent's deferential manner, of the way Otis, gruff and unyielding with every other man on the ranch, softened into something almost respectful whenever Caleb entered a room. Small threads, each one insignificant alone, but woven together, they formed a pattern she could no longer ignore, a shape just beyond the edge of her understanding patient and waiting to reveal itself. She watched the bank's agent ride away from the ranch that same afternoon his business apparently concluded, and found Caleb afterward standing alone near the corral fence, his expression distant, troubled in a way she hadn't seen from him before. "Bad news?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "Not bad," Caleb said. "Just heavy. Decisions that carry weight beyond what most men have to shoulder in a single lifetime." He glanced at her sideways, something almost apologetic in his expression. "You'll understand soon enough why I've carried it the way I have." "You keep promising that. I keep meaning it." He turned to face her fully, and for a moment, something raw and unguarded passed across his features, a vulnerability she hadn't expected from a man who had shown her nothing but calm, steady strength since the day they'd met. "I'm afraid, Martha. Afraid that once you know the whole truth, you'll see me differently, see the ranch differently, see yourself differently standing in the middle of it all." "I don't scare easy," Martha said. "Whatever it is, I intend to hear it plain and judge you by the man I've already come to know, not by whatever title or circumstance you've been hiding behind." Something in her words seemed to steady him, and he managed a small grateful smile. "I'm holding you to that." "You'd better," she said. And for a moment, standing together in the cold afternoon light, the weight between them eased just slightly, replaced by something warmer, something that felt, despite all the uncertainty still hanging over them, remarkably like hope. Martha turned that cryptic reassurance over in her mind through the following days, watching Caleb with fresh curiosity, noting the particular weight he seemed to carry as the promised revelation drew nearer. The way his eyes sometimes lingered on her across the supper table, with an expression that mixed anticipation with something that looked almost like fear, as though he worried the truth he carried might change how she saw him, might cost him something he had only recently begun to hope he might keep. She wanted to reassure him, wanted to tell him that whatever secret he carried, it would not diminish the respect she'd come to hold for the quiet, steady man who had defended her, protected her, and treated her with a dignity she'd rarely known from anyone, let alone a man she'd met only months before. But she held her tongue, sensing that whatever he needed to say it in his own time, in his own way, and that rushing him toward a confession he clearly found difficult would serve neither of them well. The final push toward that revelation came on an afternoon in mid-February when Otis called Martha aside after the noon meal, his expression carrying a gravity she hadn't seen from him since the day she'd first arrived seeking work. "Caleb's asked that the whole crew gather this evening," Otis said. "Says he's got something important to share. Wanted you to know ahead of time since I reckon what he's got to say concerns you more than most." "Do you know what it is?" Otis's weathered face softened into something almost paternal, a warmth Martha hadn't expected from the gruff foreman who had hired her that first bitter day. "I've known Caleb a long time, Mrs. Whitaker. Longer than most anybody else on this ranch. I know what he's carrying, and I know it's been eating at him harder these past weeks than I've ever seen before, watching you worrying about how you'll take what he's got to tell you." He paused, choosing his words with evident care. "Whatever he says tonight, I'd ask you to remember this. Every kindness he's shown you, every time he stood between you and harm, that was the truth of the man, not a performance calculated toward some hidden purpose. Whatever else he is, he's shown you who he really is through his actions long before tonight. You're worried I'll think less of him." "I'm worried you might think he deceived you," Otis said honestly. "And I want you to understand before you hear it from him that whatever he kept it quiet for reasons that had nothing to do with dishonesty and everything to do with wanting to be judged fair and square, same as any other man before the truth of his circumstances complicated things." "How long have you known him, Otis?" "Since he was a boy, no bigger than Tommy Briggs, following his father around this very ranch, learning every trade a man needs to run it long before he had any right to expect he'd need such learning." Otis's voice carried a warmth Martha hadn't heard from him before, the fondness of a man speaking of someone he considered close to family. "I watched him grow into the kind of man his father always hoped he'd become, though the road there weren't easy, and it cost him more than most folks would guess to look at him now, quiet and steady as he is." "What road? What did it cost him?" Otis shook his head slowly. "That's his story to tell, Mrs. Whitaker, not mine. I've already said more than I ought. Just know this, whatever comes to light tonight, the man standing in front of you telling it is the same man who stacked wood by your door that first afternoon. The same man who carried you and Caleb both to safety twice over these past weeks. The same man who's shown you nothing but honesty in every action, even when his words stayed careful. Judge him by that, and you won't go far wrong." Martha thanked him, though the conversation left her with as many new questions as it answered, and she carried those questions with her through the remainder of the afternoon, her hands moving through the familiar rhythms of supper preparation, while her mind turned circles around the mystery that would by evening's end finally find its resolution. The crew finished their chores with unusual quiet, the whole ranch seeming to hold its breath in anticipation of whatever Caleb intended to reveal. Martha went about her own preparations for the evening meal, with hands that trembled slightly despite her best efforts at composure, wondering what truth could possibly require such careful, deliberate unveiling, wondering, too, whether whatever she learned tonight would change the fragile, precious trust that had grown between her and the quiet cowboy who had come to mean more to her than she'd allowed herself to fully admit. As the sun sank low over the western ridges, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold, the crew began gathering in the largest of the ranch's outbuildings, the barn cleared and swept for the occasion. Lanterns hung along the walls, casting a warm glow against the gathering dark. Martha took her place near the front, close enough to see Caleb clearly where he stood waiting. His posture tense, despite his evident effort to appear calm, his eyes finding hers across the crowded room with an expression that carried equal parts resolve and vulnerability. Otis called the room to order, and a hush fell over the assembled crew. Dozens of weathered faces turned expectantly toward the man who had for months presented himself as nothing more than another hand. Among them a man whose quiet strength and steady character had earned him respect without ever once demanding it. A man about to reveal that the truth of who he was ran far deeper and far more consequential than any of them, save perhaps Otis himself, had ever suspected. Caleb cleared his throat, his eyes sweeping across the room before settling once more on Martha. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight and clarity that silenced even the faint creak of the old barn's timbers in the evening wind. "I owe every one of you the truth," he began, "and I've put off telling it far longer than I should have for reasons I hope you'll understand once you've heard the whole of it. Some of you have worked beside me for years and never once questioned why I lived the way I did. Others newer to this ranch have wondered plenty and kept your wondering to yourselves out of a kindness I don't know that I deserved. Tonight, that wondering ends." He paused, his gaze moving once more to Martha, steady despite the visible weight of what remained unsaid, and the whole barn seemed to lean forward as one waiting breathless for whatever truth he had carried so carefully, so quietly through every hard mile of that long Montana winter. "My name is Caleb Rowan," he said, "and that much of what you know about me is true. What most of you don't know is that my father was Nathaniel Rowan, and it was his hands that raised the first fence post on this land 30 years ago, his sweat that built the barn we're standing in tonight." A murmur rippled through the crowd, quiet at first, then rising as the weight of his words settled. "When he passed 3 years back, he left Red Valley Ranch to me. Every acre, every head of cattle, every building you sleep in and eat in and work in. I am not a hired hand, and I never have been. I own this ranch." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the shift of boots against straw and the low hiss of the lanterns. Del Hutchins, standing near the front, did not look surprised, only relieved, as though a weight he'd carried alongside Caleb had finally been set down. Tommy Briggs's mouth hung open. Somewhere near the back, one of the younger hands muttered a soft curse of disbelief. "You mean to tell me," said a grizzled hand named Amos, who'd worked the ranch longer than most anyone save Otis and Del, "that we've been taking orders from Otis all this time, and the real boss was standing right there next to us mucking the same stalls?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Caleb said, "and I understand if some of you feel deceived. That wasn't my intention. I wanted to know this ranch the way my father knew it, not from a ledger book in a warm office, but from the ground up, same as every man who's ever worked this land." "Well, I'll be damned," Amos muttered, though there was no real anger in it, only stunned reassessment. "Explains why Otis never once raised his voice at you, even that time you near burned down the east barn trying to fix the wiring yourself." A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the crowd, breaking some of the tension, and Caleb allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "I never claimed to be handy with wiring. Cattle and horses, yes. Wiring, apparently not." Martha felt the ground shift beneath her, not literally, but in every sense that mattered, the careful architecture of what she'd understood about Caleb Rowan collapsing and rebuilding itself in the space of a single sentence. She thought of every moment he'd deferred to Otis in public, while clearly carrying more authority than any hand should possess. She thought of the letters, the bank agent, the quiet weight he'd carried through every conversation for months. Why? The question came from one of the older hands, gruff, but not unkind. "Why work alongside us like some common cowhand when you could have sat up in that house and given orders?" Caleb's eyes moved slowly across the assembled crew before settling finally on Martha. "Because my father built this ranch with his own 2 hands, and I refuse to inherit it without understanding in my own bones what it cost the men who work it. I've mucked stalls same as you, broken horses same as you, frozen half to death chasing strays same as you. I wanted to earn the respect this land demands, not simply claim it, because my name happened to be on a deed." A few of the men exchanged glances, something like admiration passing between them, and Otis stepped forward to stand beside Caleb, his weathered face solemn. "I've known this man since he was in short pants," Otis said. "Watched him choose the hardest road every time an easier one was offered. Whatever else changes tonight, know this. The Caleb Rowan who's fed you, defended you, and worked beside you these past months, that man ain't a lie. That's exactly who he is." The crew began to murmur among themselves, the shock settling gradually into something more complicated. Respect mingled with the awkward recalibration of men realizing they'd spent months treating an owner as an equal, unaware of the gap between them. But Martha's mind had already moved past the ranch, past the fences and cattle, and deed, circling back to something Caleb had said weeks before, about reasons he couldn't yet share about a debt he owed that had nothing to do with land. "There's more," Caleb said, and something in his voice made the room go still again, quieter this time, sharper, as though every man present sensed the conversation was shifting towards something more personal than property. "Something I owe to one person here, especially, and I mean to say it in front of all of you, because I've hidden behind silence long enough." He looked at Martha now fully, and the vulnerability in his expression stole the breath from her chest. "6 years ago," Caleb said, "I was passing through a town in Wyoming delivering cattle for my father. I stopped in a mercantile for supplies, and I witnessed a woman being humiliated in the street, mocked for her size, for her plainness, by a group of men who thought their cruelty was sport. I remember her clearly. I remember the way she stood there taking every word, refusing to run, refusing to cry in front of them, though I could see it cost her everything she had to hold that composure. And I remember that I did nothing. I stood at the edge of that street and watched, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, and I rode on with my cattle and left her there." The barn had gone utterly silent now. Every eye moving between Caleb and Martha, the crowd sensing before Martha herself fully allowed the recognition to surface exactly where this confession was heading. "That woman was you, Martha," Caleb said quietly. "I recognized you the moment you walked through that gate 3 months ago. I've carried the shame of that day in Wyoming every single year since, wondering what became of you. Wondering if I could have spared you even a fraction of that cruelty, if I'd simply had the courage to step in. When you arrived here, asking for work, half frozen, carrying nothing but an old bag, and more dignity than any person I've ever met, I knew exactly who you were. And I said nothing." Martha's chest tightened, memory and present colliding in a way that left her breathless. The shame of that Wyoming street rising fresh and raw, despite the years that had passed. "Why?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Why didn't you say something the day I arrived?" "Because I didn't want you to think I hired you out of guilt," Caleb said, his voice thick with an emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. "I didn't want your position here, your worth on this ranch, to be built on pity or debt. I wanted you to earn your place through your own skill, your own strength, exactly as you have, so that when I finally told you the truth, you'd know without doubt that everything you'd built here was entirely your own doing. Not charity. Not an apology dressed up as employment. Yours." The crew had gone so quiet that Martha could hear the wind pressing against the barn walls outside, the lanterns hissing softly in the charged silence. She felt dozens of eyes on her waiting, and for a moment she couldn't find words adequate to the storm of feeling rising in her chest. Anger and grief, and something achingly close to tenderness, all tangled together in a knot she couldn't immediately unravel. "You watched me be humiliated," she said slowly, "and you did nothing. And then years later, you watched me arrive here in the same condition, hungry and desperate, and mocked all over again by different men in a different yard. And still you said nothing. Watched it happen a second time before you finally decided to intervene." "Yes." Caleb did not flinch from the accusation, did not look away. "I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like cowardice dressed up as strategy, but I swear to you, Martha, every single day since you arrived, I've wrestled with whether my silence was protecting you or protecting myself from having to admit what I failed to do 6 years ago. I am not a project, Caleb." Martha's voice grew stronger now, the shock giving way to something fiercer, something that had carried her through every hard year of her life. "I am not a guilt you get to resolve by watching me from a careful distance and calling it respect. I am not a burden you failed to lift once, and now feel obligated to lift twice as hard to balance some ledger only you can see. I know that. Do you?" She stepped closer, and the whole barn seemed to hold its breath around them. Forgotten now, the audience reduced to background as the two of them faced each other in the lantern light. "Because everything you've just told this room sounds like a man who spent 3 months treating me like unfinished business, like a wrong he needed to right before he could sleep easy again. That's not what this is." Caleb's voice cracked slightly, the first genuine break in his composure Martha had ever witnessed. "Martha, I have watched you rebuild a ruined kitchen with your bare hands. I've watched you stand up to men twice your size without flinching, watched you comfort a grieving boy, watched you show mercy to a thief when cruelty would have been easier, watched you face down a man who meant you real harm with nothing but a kitchen knife and sheer will. None of that has anything to do with Wyoming. That's who you are entirely apart from whatever guilt I've carried. I didn't fall into respecting you because of what I witnessed 6 years ago. I fell into respecting you because of who you've shown yourself to be every single day since you walked through that gate. Martha searched his face for any trace of deception, any hint that his words were merely a convenient smoothing over of an uncomfortable truth, and found instead only raw, unguarded sincerity. The same steady honesty she'd come to trust in him since that first bitter afternoon. "You should have told me," she said, quieter now, some of the fire banking into something more exhausted, more wounded. "The day I arrived. You should have told me who you were and what you remembered. I had a right to know." "You did," Caleb agreed. "And I was wrong to withhold it even for reasons I believed were sound. I'm sorry, Martha. Truly sorry. Not for failing to help you in Wyoming, though that failure haunts me still, but for letting that old shame dictate how I treated you here, for letting my fear of your judgment outweigh your right to the truth." The crew remained frozen around them, witnesses to something far more intimate than any of them had anticipated when they'd gathered expecting news of ranch ownership. Del Hutchins shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between the instinct to give the two of them privacy and the impossibility of an entire barn quietly filing out mid-confrontation. Otis, ever practical, finally cleared his throat. "Might be the rest of us ought to give these two some room," he said, and the crew began to disperse slowly, murmuring among themselves, casting curious glances back over their shoulders as they filed out into the cold evening air, leaving Martha and Caleb alone beneath the lantern light, with the horses shifting quietly in their stalls nearby. "I don't know what to do with what you've told me," Martha admitted once the barn had emptied enough that her voice no longer needed to carry beyond the two of them. "Part of me wants to be furious with you for the silence. Part of me understands exactly why you kept it. And another part of me keeps circling back to Wyoming, to that street, wondering what I would have felt if you had stepped forward that day, if a stranger had simply told those men to leave me be." "I've wondered the same thing more nights than I can count," Caleb said. "Whether it would have mattered, whether one voice raised in my defense would have changed anything about how that day ended, or whether the men doing the mocking would have simply turned their cruelty toward me instead and left you no better off." "It would have mattered," Martha said, "not because it would have stopped them, but because I would have known at least once in my life that someone saw what was happening and refused to simply watch." Caleb's jaw tightened, the weight of her words landing with visible force. "Then let me be that person now. Not to erase what I failed to do then, because I know that can't be undone, but because I want to be the kind of man who stands up when it matters from this day forward, whether or not there's an old debt attached to the standing." Martha studied him for a long moment, the lantern light catching the exhaustion and hope warring openly across his features, and something in her chest, some long-guarded wall she'd built brick by brick across years of disappointment, shifted just slightly, not collapsing, but allowing for the first time a narrow gap through which something warmer might pass. "I need you to understand something," she said finally. "I've spent my whole life being seen as a problem to solve a body, to comment on a burden, to either mock or pity. I came to this ranch wanting neither. I wanted honest work and an honest wage, and nothing more complicated than that. If you and I are going to move forward from tonight, I need to know that whatever this is between us, it's built on who I actually am, not on the woman you glimpsed once on a street in Wyoming and have been trying to save ever since." "It is," Caleb said without hesitation. "Martha, I respect you because you rebuilt a ruined cookhouse with nothing but your own 2 hands and a fierce refusal to be diminished. I respect you because you handled Wade Mercer with a steadiness that would have broken lesser people. I respect you because you extended mercy to Boone Talley even after he'd wronged you, because your first instinct, even now standing in the wreckage of a secret I should have told you months ago, is to ask hard, fair questions rather than simply walk away in anger. None of that has one thing to do with pity. It has everything to do with who you are." The silence that followed carried a different weight than the shocked stillness of moments before, something gentler, more fragile. The sound of 2 people standing at the edge of a decision, neither had fully anticipated making. Martha felt the tears she'd refused to shed in front of cruel men finally threaten at the edges of her composure, not from sorrow this time, but from the strange, unfamiliar relief of being seen so completely flaws and strength, both by someone who had chosen deliberately and repeatedly to stay. "I don't forgive easily," she said, her voice rough. "And I won't pretend what you told me tonight doesn't sting. It does. It will for a while yet." "I don't expect easy forgiveness," Caleb said. "I only ask for the chance to keep proving every day going forward that I'm worth the trust you've already given me, whether or not I've fully earned it yet." Martha nodded slowly, some of the tension easing from her shoulders, replaced by a tired, cautious hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember. "Then, earn it," she said. "One day at a time. No more secrets, Caleb. Whatever comes next, I need honesty first." "You have it," Caleb said. "Every day from here forward." They stood together in the quiet barn, the lanterns burning low, the horses settling into their evening rest around them, and for the first time since she'd walked through the gate of Red Valley Ranch 3 months before, Martha allowed herself to imagine, however cautiously, that the life waiting for her here might hold more than mere survival. It might if she let it hold something worth calling home. Sleep did not come easily that night. Martha lay awake in the small back room of the cookhouse, staring at the ceiling beams, while the wind pressed steady against the walls, turning over every word Caleb had spoken, testing each one for the seams of deception she'd learned through hard experience to search for in any man's kindness. She found none. That absence unsettled her almost as much as betrayal would have, because it meant she had no ready excuse left to keep the careful distance she'd maintained around her heart for so many years. By the time dawn broke gray and cold over the ranch, Martha had made her peace with at least one truth, whatever came next between her and Caleb Rowan. She would not spend it drowning in old Wyoming ghosts. She rose, built the fire, and began the morning's work with the same steady discipline that had carried her through every hard season of her life. Though her hands moved a fraction slower than usual, weighted by thoughts she hadn't yet finished untangling, Caleb found her there an hour later, his own eyes shadowed with the same sleeplessness that had claimed her, a folded paper held carefully in one hand. "I brought you something," he said, setting the paper on the table beside her. "Figured after last night you deserved to see it plain, rather than take my word alone." Martha wiped her hands on her apron and unfolded the paper carefully. It was a copy of the ranch's deed, her own name absent from it entirely as she'd expected, but Caleb's father's signature transferring ownership to Caleb clearly dated 3 years prior, long before she'd ever set foot on Montana soil. "I'm not showing you this to prove I'm not lying," Caleb said. "I'm showing you because I want you to see in writing exactly how long I've carried this ranch alone, and exactly how long I've had the power to change your circumstances here at a word, and chose instead to let you build your place through your own hands. I want that choice to mean something to you even now, even with everything else laid bare between us." Martha studied the paper a long moment, then set it down and looked up at him, something in her chest loosening slightly at the evident vulnerability in his offering this small, careful gesture of a man determined to earn trust rather than simply demand it. "It does mean something," she admitted. "I won't pretend last night didn't shake me, Caleb. It did, and it will for a while yet. But I see what you're trying to show me, and I appreciate it more than you probably realize." "That's all I'm asking for," Caleb said. "Time and the chance to keep showing you rather than simply telling you." "Tommy's going to have questions," Martha said, deflecting slightly from the weight of the moment, though a small, genuine smile tugged at her mouth. "So will half the crew if Amos's reaction last night is any indication." "Let them ask," Caleb said. "I've spent 3 years hiding behind careful distance and quiet authority. Reckon it's past time I let this ranch see me plain, same as I've asked you to see me plain." Del Hutchins found them there a short while later, offering Martha a knowing look that suggested he'd guessed more of the previous night's events than either of them had told him directly. "Crew's settling down some," he reported. "Amos already telling anybody who'll listen how he always suspected something was off about Caleb's manners. though I recall him laughing loudest of anybody at that Christmas joke back when Mrs. Whitaker first arrived. Selective memory, Caleb said dryly. Common ailment among cowboys. Common ailment among most folks, I'd wager, Dell said, his eyes crinkling with quiet amusement before turning more serious. For what it's worth, Mrs. Whitaker, this ranch is better for having you in it, deed or no deed, secret or no secret. Whatever you two work out between yourselves, don't let it cost this place the best cook it's ever had. I don't intend to go anywhere, Dell, Martha said. Not unless somebody gives me a reason worth leaving for. Good, Dell said, satisfied, and ambled off toward the barn, leaving Martha and Caleb alone once more in the gray morning light. I meant what I said last night, Caleb told her quietly once Dell had gone, about earning your trust one day at a time. I don't expect that to happen quickly, and I don't intend to rush you toward feelings you're not ready to name. But I want you to know plainly, without riddles or secrets standing between us anymore, that what I feel for you has grown into something far beyond an old debt from Wyoming. It's grown into respect and admiration, and something warmer than either of those words quite capture. Martha felt the weight of his honesty settle over her, gentle but undeniable. And though the wound of his silence still ached somewhere beneath her ribs, she found herself, for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, willing to let that ache exist alongside something hopeful rather than in place of it. One day at a time, she agreed. That's a fair enough place to start. Caleb nodded, something like relief passing across his weathered features, and for a long moment they simply stood together in the cold morning air, the ranch stirring to life around them. The truth finally laid bare between them, after months of careful silence and whatever came next. At least now they would face it honestly, together with nothing left hidden in the shadows. There's one more thing, Caleb said, breaking the quiet. Otis mentioned you might have questions about your position here now, given what you've learned. I want you to know plainly nothing about your place on this ranch changes because of who I turned out to be. Your wage stands. Your authority over this kitchen stands. If anything, I intend to see both increased, not out of guilt, but because you've more than earned it through the work you've done. I appreciate that, Martha said, though I suspect Amos and the others will be watching a bit more carefully now to see whether the cook gets special treatment on account of the boss taking a liking to her. Let them watch, Caleb said. I've got nothing to hide anymore. Not about the ranch, and not about how I feel toward you. Martha felt her cheeks warm, despite the cold morning air. An unfamiliar, unguarded reaction she hadn't allowed herself in longer than she could remember. That's a bold thing to admit in broad daylight, Mr. Rowan. Reckon I've done enough hiding for one lifetime, Caleb said, the ghost of his rare smile finally breaking free, warmer now than she'd ever seen it. Figured it was past time I started saying things plain. She held his gaze a long moment, something settling between them that felt for the first time since Wyoming less like a wound and more like the beginning of something worth tending carefully. And together they turned back toward the work of the morning, the ranch waking fully around them under a pale winter sun. Tommy Briggs came bounding up a moment later, breathless with the particular excitement of a boy who'd stayed up half the night turning over the previous evening's revelations. Is it true, Mr. Rowan? You really own the whole ranch? All of it? Every acre? Caleb confirmed, ruffling the boy's hair with an easy affection that seemed to Martha's eye entirely unpracticed for a man who'd only just been unveiled as the ranch's true owner. Don't reckon that changes much about how you and I get along, though. Still expect you up before dawn, same as always. Wouldn't dream of asking otherwise. Tommy said, grinning, and dashed off toward the barn with the boundless energy of a boy who'd found the whole situation far more thrilling than troubling. Martha watched him go, then glanced back at Caleb, who was watching her with an expression that carried equal parts hope and lingering uncertainty, as though he half expected her even now to change her mind and walk away from everything the previous night had unearthed. She reached out deliberately and touched his arm, a small gesture, but one that carried more weight than either of them said aloud. Go see to your horses, Mr. Rowan, she said. I've got biscuits to bake, and a ranch full of hungry men who don't much care whose name is on the deed, so long as breakfast comes on time. Caleb laughed low and genuine, a sound Martha realized she wanted to hear again often for as long as this strange, hard-won trust between them continued to grow. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and tipped his hat before heading toward the barn, leaving Martha standing in the cold morning light, her heart lighter than it had been in longer than she could remember, ready to face whatever came next. Word of Caleb's true identity spread through the bunkhouse and beyond, within days carried by riders passing through to neighboring spreads, until half the county seemed to know that the quiet cowboy who mucked stalls at Red Valley Ranch was in fact its sole owner. Martha braced herself for a shift in how the crew treated her, certain that whatever fragile respect she'd earned would now be reinterpreted through the lens of favoritism. But the change when it came surprised her by moving in the opposite direction entirely. "Figured you'd want to know," Dell said one morning, setting down a fresh split of firewood by the cookhouse door. "The boys have been talking. Not about Caleb owning the place, though there's been plenty of that too. About you. About how you earned your keep here fair and square, long before any of us knew who Caleb really was, and how that means something more, now not less." "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning most of them feel a little ashamed looking back at how they treated you that first day," Dell said. "Amos especially. Man's been kicking himself all week over that Christmas joke." Martha allowed herself a small, tired smile. "Tell Amos I've heard worse than a Christmas joke, and forgiven quicker things than that." "I'll tell him," Dell said, "though I suspect he'll want to hear it from you himself if you're willing." She was willing. And when Amos found her later that same day, hat twisted awkwardly in his weathered hands, his usual bluster entirely absent, Martha met his stammering apology with the same steady grace she extended to every honest attempt at amends. "I said things that first day I got no business saying," Amos told her, staring at his boots. "About your size, your looks. Wasn't right then, and knowing now what kind of woman you turned out to be, it sits even worse with me. I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitaker. Truly." "Apology accepted, Amos," Martha said. "Now go fetch some more wood before Dell decides I'm running short on patience as well as firewood." Amos left considerably lighter than he'd arrived, and Martha found watching him go that forgiveness came easier than she'd expected, not because the old wounds no longer stung, but because she'd learned over the hard months of that Montana winter that genuine change mattered more than perfect memory. She could hold both truths at once, that these men had wronged her, and that they'd grown enough to recognize it without either truth erasing the other. The weeks that followed carried the ranch deeper into the punishing final stretch of winter storms, rolling through with a ferocity that tested every hand's endurance. Calving season stretching thin the crew's patience and strength in equal measure. Martha found herself managing not merely the cookhouse, but increasingly the broader rhythm of feeding and provisioning a larger operation than she'd first arrived to serve as Caleb freed, now from the burden of hiding. His position began expanding the ranch's operations with a confidence that had clearly been waiting years for the chance to emerge. "We're bringing on 6 more hands come spring," he told her one evening, spreading a ledger across the cookhouse table while Martha kneaded dough at the counter nearby. "Meaning 6 more mouths to feed on top of everyone already here. I know that's asking a great deal of one cook. Then you'd best plan on building me a proper kitchen to match," Martha said, not looking up from her work. "Because this cookhouse was built for half the crew we're feeding now, and it shows every time supper hour comes around." Caleb looked up from the ledger, something considering in his expression. "You're right. I should have thought of that sooner." He made a note in the margin of his ledger. "I'll have Otis and the boys start clearing ground for an expansion before the spring thaw sets in proper. Bigger stove, more storage room, enough for 2 cooks if you ever want the help." "I don't need help," Martha said, though the offer warmed something in her chest regardless. "But I won't turn down a kitchen big enough to actually move around in without knocking my elbows on every shelf." "Consider it done," Caleb said, and the easy confidence in his voice, the way he'd taken her simple observation and turned it immediately into action, reminded Martha once again of the quiet authority that had always run beneath his careful humility, now finally allowed to surface without apology. Their conversations had grown like that in the weeks since his revelation, comfortable and direct, stripped of the careful evasions that had once colored every exchange between them. Martha found herself looking forward to the evening hours when the crew had retired, and Caleb lingered in the cookhouse, ostensibly reviewing ranch business. But increasingly, she suspected simply seeking her company. The two of them talking through the day's small triumphs and frustrations, with an ease that felt more each week like the natural rhythm of two people building something together rather than merely coexisting. Not every hand had accepted the new arrangement gracefully. A newer man named Silas hired on only weeks before Caleb's revelation, and thus lacking the months of hard-earned respect the older hands carried for Martha, made the mistake of testing the new order during a particularly grueling week of calving. "Don't see why the cook gets special say over how the kitchen's run," Silas grumbled to another hand within Martha's hearing. "Just 'cause the boss has taken a shine to her, man starts thinking with something other than his head, whole ranch suffers for it." Martha set down the pot she'd been scrubbing and turned to face him directly, her expression calm but carrying an edge that had grown sharper, not softer in the months since her arrival. "Mr. Silas, I ran this kitchen long before anyone here knew Caleb Rowan owned a single acre of this ranch. My authority here was earned through months of feeding this crew through the hardest winter this valley's seen in years, not granted through anybody's romantic favor. You're welcome to test that authority if you'd like, but I promise you'll find it considerably sturdier than you're currently assuming." Silas flushed and mumbled something that might have been an apology, retreating quickly from the kitchen, and Dell, who'd witnessed the exchange from his seat by the stove, chuckled low into his coffee. "Boy's got a lot to learn about this ranch," he said. "Mainly that underestimating you is the fastest way to embarrass himself in front of the whole crew." "He'll learn or he won't," Martha said, returning to her scrubbing. "Either way, it's not my job to soften the lesson for him." Caleb, informed of the exchange later that evening, offered no comment beyond a small satisfied smile that told Martha he'd expected nothing less from her and needed to intervene on her behalf, not at all. It was a small thing, that trust, but it settled something in her chest, regardless the growing certainty that whatever partnership was forming between them, it would not require her to become smaller or quieter to accommodate his position. Spring arrived slowly across the valley, the snow retreating in fits and starts, exposing patches of mud and the first stubborn shoots of green beneath the melting drifts. The ranch's rhythm shifted with the season calving, giving way to branding the crew's exhaustion tempered by the visible proof of a hard winter finally loosening its grip. Martha's kitchen expanded now, as Caleb had promised, buzzed with a new energy, the added space allowing her to prepare meals for the growing crew without the cramped frustration of the old arrangement. It was during this stretch, with the worst of winter's danger finally behind them, that Caleb approached her one evening with a formality that immediately caught her attention. His hat held in both hands rather than settled on his head, his posture carrying the particular stiffness of a man rehearsing words he'd clearly turned over many times before speaking them aloud. "Martha," he said, "I'd like to ask you something, and I want you to feel entirely free to say no without any worry that it'll change how things stand between us on this ranch." That's an ominous opening, Caleb Rowan. Not ominous, just important. He took a breath, steadying himself visibly before continuing. "I'd like your permission to court you properly. Not in secret, not through careful glances and half-said things, but plain in front of the whole ranch, the way a man ought to court a woman he respects and admires as much as I've come to respect and admire you." Martha felt her heart quicken, despite her best efforts at composure, though she kept her expression carefully measured, unwilling to answer such an important question with anything less than full honesty. "You understand this is complicated, Caleb. You own this ranch. I work for you. Whatever grows between us, it won't unfold the way it might if we'd met as equals in some ordinary town with ordinary circumstances." "I understand that," Caleb said, "and I don't have a tidy answer for how we navigate that complication, except to say that I intend to treat you as an equal in every way that matters, regardless of whose name sits on the deed. Your voice in this kitchen, in this partnership, in whatever we build together, carries the same weight as mine. That's not a promise I'm making lightly." "What about the crew? What will they think watching their boss court the cook?" "Some will think it's romantic," Caleb said. "Some will think it's foolish. A few, like Silas, might think it's evidence of exactly the kind of favoritism he already accused you of benefiting from. But Martha, I've spent 3 years living my life according to what this crew might think, hiding my ownership, softening my authority, careful never to overstep the careful balance I'd built for myself. I'm tired of living that way. I want to court you plainly and let whatever consequences follow, simply follow. Martha studied him a long moment, weighing the risk against the growing certainty in her own heart, the slow, patient trust that had built between them across months of hardship and honesty. Both. I won't rush into this, she said finally. I've been burned before by men who promised more than they delivered, and I won't pretend the complication of your position here doesn't worry me at least a little. I don't expect you to rush, Caleb said. I only want the chance to try slowly, honestly, and let you decide for yourself over time whether what we're building is worth the complication. Then you have my permission, Martha said, to court me slowly and honestly, and in full view of anyone who cares to watch. But I reserve the right to change my mind if I find you courting me any differently than that. Caleb's answering smile carried a warmth Martha hadn't seen from him before. Unguarded and genuine, the smile of a man who'd just received something he'd wanted badly enough to risk real vulnerability in asking for it. I wouldn't dream of courting you any other way, Mrs. Whitaker. Word of their arrangement spread through the ranch within days, as such things inevitably do, and Martha braced herself once more for judgment, for whispered comments about favoritism or impropriety. What she found instead surprised her nearly as much as the crew's earlier apologies, had a general warmth of approval that suggested most of the hands had seen this development coming long before either she or Caleb had fully admitted it to themselves. About time, Dell said when Martha mentioned the arrangement to him directly, wanting him to hear it plainly, rather than through ranch gossip. Man's been mooning over you since the day you arrived, though it took him 3 months and a confession about Wyoming to finally work up the nerve to say so plain. You knew about Wyoming. Not the particulars, Dell admitted. But I knew something was eating at him regarding you, something deeper than simple attraction. Figured he'd tell you when he was ready, and figured it weren't my place to press him toward it faster than he could manage. Tommy Briggs. When he learned of the courtship, greeted the news with the unguarded enthusiasm of a boy who'd clearly been hoping for exactly this outcome. Does this mean you'll be staying on permanent, Mrs. Whitaker, not just as cook, but as... He flushed, slightly uncertain how to finish the sentence. As whatever comes of this courtship, if anything comes of it at all, Martha said gently. But yes, Tommy, I intend to stay on this ranch regardless of how things unfold between Caleb and myself. This has become home to me more than any place I've lived in longer than I care to admit. Good, Tommy said, satisfied. This ranch wouldn't be the same without your biscuits. Even Silas, chastened by his earlier missteps, offered Martha a grudging nod of acknowledgement when the news reached him, though he said nothing further on the matter, apparently having learned at least partially the lesson Dell had predicted he'd eventually absorb. The courtship that followed unfolded with a careful, deliberate pace that suited them both. Evening walks along the fence line after supper, conversations that stretched long into the night about childhoods and dreams, and the particular griefs each of them had carried alone for too many years before finding unexpectedly someone willing to share the weight. Caleb told her more of his father, of the man's quiet expectations, and the particular loneliness of inheriting responsibility before he felt entirely ready to carry it. Martha told him in careful pieces, across many evenings of her own history of the family she'd lost young, of the string of towns and positions that had led her eventually to a stage stop in Montana, with nothing but an old bag and a stubborn refusal to be turned away. I keep thinking, Caleb told her one evening, the two of them standing near the corral fence while the horses grazed peacefully in the gathering dusk, about how close I came to losing the chance to know you properly. If I'd stepped in that day in Wyoming, maybe you'd have gone your whole life, never knowing my name, never needing the kind of rescue that would have brought you here. And I find myself grateful in some strange way for my own old cowardice, because it left the door open for us to meet again on different terms when I finally had the courage to do right by you. That's a complicated thing to be grateful for, Martha said, though she understood the sentiment beneath his words, the tangled knot of guilt and gratitude that came from recognizing how much pain had shaped the path toward something good. Complicated, Caleb agreed, but honest. I won't pretend I'm grateful for what you suffered in Wyoming, or grateful that you had to walk 4 miles through a Montana blizzard with nothing but an old bag and a prayer that somebody would finally give you honest work. But I am grateful deeply and completely that both those hard roads eventually led you here to this ranch to me. Martha reached out, taking his hand where it rested on the fence post, a gesture that had grown easier and more natural with each passing week of their careful courtship. I've stopped resenting the hard roads, she said. Most of them anyway. They made me who I am, same as your own hard road made you who you are. I'd rather be grateful for where we've ended up than bitter about how we got here. That's a wiser philosophy than most folks manage, Caleb said, squeezing her hand gently. I've had a lot of practice at survival, Martha said. Wisdom's usually just survival with the benefit of hindsight. The spring deepened around them, the ranch coming fully back to life after the long winter's grip. New calves stumbling across greening pastures, the crew's mood lightening with each passing week of milder weather. Martha's kitchen ran smoother than it ever had the expanded space, allowing her to manage the larger crew with an ease that would have seemed impossible during those first desperate weeks of the previous winter. She'd taken on a young woman from a neighboring ranch, a widow named Sarah Combs, to help with the growing workload, and found in training Sarah through the particular rhythms she'd developed over months of trial and hard-won experience, a satisfaction she hadn't expected from the role of teacher rather than sole laborer. You've built something remarkable here, Caleb told her one afternoon, watching from the cookhouse doorway as Martha guided Sarah through the proper technique for a large batch of bread destined to feed the whole crew through a long day of branding. This kitchen, this operation, it's more than just meals anymore. It's the heart of this whole ranch. I had good material to work with, Martha said. Even if it didn't look like much that first bitter afternoon I arrived. I remember exactly how it looked that first afternoon, Caleb said, and I remember exactly how you looked standing at that gate with nothing but an old bag and more determination than any person I'd ever witnessed. I knew even then, before I'd let myself fully admit it, that you were going to change everything about this ranch and about me. Martha felt the familiar warmth that had come to characterize these quiet exchanges between them, the growing certainty that whatever complications remained in their unusual courtship, the foundation beneath it had grown solid and true through months of shared hardship and honest reckoning. You're getting sentimental in your old age, Caleb Rowan. Reckon I am. Caleb admitted, the ghost of his rare smile finally settling into something more permanent, more natural, worn easily now rather than guarded carefully behind months of careful silence. Figure a man's allowed some sentiment once he's finally stopped hiding from the things that matter most to him. The formal courtship continued through the following weeks with a steadiness that surprised even Martha, who had expected, based on hard experience, that any romantic attention from a man of Caleb's position would eventually reveal itself as fickle or conditional. Instead, she found him constant in ways both large and small, showing up each evening regardless of exhaustion, remembering details of conversations from weeks before, treating her opinions on ranch matters with the same weight he gave Otis's counsel, never once suggesting through word or action that her position as cook diminished her standing as a partner in whatever future they were slowly building together. That steadiness was tested sooner than either of them expected, when a late spring storm rolled unexpectedly down from the mountains, catching the ranch mid-branding with half the crew scattered across the far pastures, and no warning beyond a sudden ominous darkening of the western sky. Martha watched from the cookhouse window as the wind picked up with alarming speed, and within the hour, hail began hammering the roof hard enough to rattle the window panes, the temperature dropping so fast that her breath fogged even inside the kitchen. "Riders are still out," Sarah Combs said, worry creasing her young face as she peered through the frosting glass. "Mr. Rowan among them, far as I know." Martha's stomach tightened, old instincts from the January blizzard rising fresh and urgent. She did not hesitate before gathering blankets, filling every available vessel with hot coffee, and organizing Sarah and two of the younger hands who'd remained behind into a makeshift relief effort, determined that whoever came through that door half frozen would find warmth and care waiting rather than chaos. It was nearly 2 hours before the first riders straggled back, Otis among them, his face wind-burned and grim. "Caleb and Dell are still out," he said, accepting a cup of coffee with hands that shook slightly from cold. "Got separated from the rest of us trying to bring in a straggling group of yearlings near the ridge. Storm came up too fast for anybody to plan for it proper." Martha felt fear settle cold and sharp in her chest, though she kept her hand steady as she continued distributing coffee and blankets to the returning hands, refusing to let panic override the practical work, still demanding her attention. "How bad is the ridge in this weather?" "Bad," Otis admitted. "Ice underfoot, visibility next to nothing. If they lost their bearings even a little, they could be riding in circles out there, or worse, caught somewhere exposed with no shelter." The next hour passed with an agonizing slowness that Martha would remember afterward as one of the longest stretches of her life, worse even than the night she'd found Caleb pinned beneath his fallen horse, because this time there was no clear direction to run toward, no lantern light to follow through the storm. She kept herself busy, because idleness would have meant surrendering to the fear clawing at her chest, organizing supplies, checking on the younger hands, sending up silent, fierce prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood. It was Tommy Briggs keeping watch at the window, despite Martha's repeated insistence that he come away from the cold glass, who finally shouted the news that broke the terrible tension gripping the cookhouse. Riders coming through the gate. Martha was out the door before conscious thought caught up with her body, running through the freezing rain toward the two exhausted figures leading their horses through the gate. And when she saw Caleb's face pale, but unmistakably alive, unmistakably whole. Something in her chest that had been clenched tight for hours finally released in a rush that left her briefly unsteady on her feet. "You're all right," she said, reaching him, her hands finding his arms, his shoulders confirming with touch what her eyes had already told her. "You're actually all right." "Bit frozen," Caleb admitted, though his voice carried warmth despite the chattering of his teeth. "But whole. Dell and I found shelter in an old line shack near the ridge, waited out the worst of it before we dared try the ride back. I was terrified." Martha admitted the words escaping before she could soften them into something more composed. "I kept thinking of that night with your horse and how much worse this storm was, and I couldn't—" She stopped, her voice catching. Caleb's expression softened, and despite his exhaustion, he reached up to cup her face gently in his cold hands. "I'm here, Martha. I'm not going anywhere, not by choice, and certainly not to some Montana blizzard's whims." "You'd better not," Martha said, her voice fierce, despite the tears finally slipping free. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed through the whole agonizing wait. "I've only just started building something worth keeping with you. I won't have you frozen to death on some ridge before we've had the chance to see it through properly. Then I'll do my very best to stay alive and inconvenient for you a good while longer," Caleb said. And despite everything, despite the cold and exhaustion and lingering fear, Martha found herself laughing, the sound breaking loose from her chest like something that had been dammed up far too long. Dell, watching the exchange with a knowing smile despite his own exhaustion, cleared his throat pointedly. "Reckon I'll just go warm up by the fire and let you two finish this particular conversation in private." He ambled off towards the cookhouse, leaving Martha and Caleb alone in the fading storm. And Caleb, still holding her face gently in his cold hands, studied her a long moment with an expression that carried none of the careful reservation he'd maintained through months of cautious courtship. "Martha Whitaker," he said quietly, "I don't intend to rush you toward anything you're not ready for, but I want you to know plainly that standing out here in this cold watching your face when you realized I was safe, I understood something I've been circling around for weeks now. I love you, not out of guilt, not out of some old Wyoming debt, but simply because of who you are and who you've shown me. I might become standing beside someone brave enough to match my own hard-won honesty." Martha felt the words settle over her, like the first warm promise of spring after the longest winter of her life, and though she did not answer immediately, some part of her recognized with a certainty that surprised her by its simplicity. that she had been waiting without fully admitting it to herself to hear exactly those words from exactly this man. "I'm not ready to take it back," she admitted honestly. "Not because I don't feel something close to it already, but because I've learned to be careful with words that large. Give me a little more time, Caleb, and I suspect you'll have your answer." "I've got nothing but time," Caleb said, "and considerably more patience than I once thought I possessed." They stood together a moment longer in the last drifting remnants of the storm, and then, practical necessity reasserting itself, Martha finally stepped back, wiping the last of her tears away with brisk efficiency. "You need dry clothes and hot food before you catch your death after all this drama," she said. "Come on, I've got stew that's been simmering since this whole mess started, and you look like a man who could use some of it." "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said, the warmth in his voice carrying more genuine happiness than Martha had ever heard from him, and together they walked back toward the cookhouse, toward warmth and light and the waiting crew. It was Otis, of all people, who finally voiced what the whole ranch had apparently been quietly observing for weeks. "Never seen the boy this settled?" he told Martha one evening, finding her alone in the cookhouse after the crew had retired. "Not since before his father passed. You've done something for him, Mrs. Whitaker, something I wasn't sure anybody could manage after the weight he's carried these past 3 years. He's done plenty for me as well," Martha said. "More than I expected to find on any ranch in any circumstance." "Good," Otis said. "Man deserves some happiness after everything he's shouldered alone for so long. And so, if you'll permit an old foreman's opinion, do you?" Martha thanked him, moved more than she let show, and found herself in the quiet hours after the ranch had settled into sleep, allowing herself finally to imagine a future she'd stopped daring to hope for during the hardest years of her life. Not merely survival, not merely honest work and an honest wage, but something richer, something built on mutual respect and hard-won trust. Something that felt more each day remarkably like the beginning of a genuine partnership between two people who had each in their own difficult ways learned exactly what it cost to stand alone and exactly what it meant finally to choose not to. The weeks that followed carried Martha and Caleb further into a rhythm that felt more each day like the natural shape of a life built on equal footing rather than favor or obligation. The kitchen ran with a steadiness that had become almost effortless. Sarah Combs proving quick to learn and eager to please. The crew settled into the particular contentment that comes from good food, fair treatment, and a season finally turning toward warmth after a brutal winter's grip. But beneath that surface calm, Martha felt something else stirring quieter and more persistent, the slow unfolding of feelings she'd guarded fiercely since Wyoming, since every hard year before and after it. She found herself watching Caleb across the supper table with an attention that had shifted sometime in the preceding weeks from cautious assessment to something warmer, something she recognized with a mixture of hope and lingering fear as genuine affection settling into something deeper. She caught herself smiling at small things he did, without thinking the way he always thanked her for coffee, even after months of receiving it daily. The patient way he explained ranch matters to Tommy Briggs, without ever making the boy feel foolish, for not already knowing the quiet respect he extended to every hand regardless of rank or tenure. "You've gone soft on him," Dell observed one morning, catching Martha's expression as she watched Caleb cross the yard toward the barn, his stride easy, his laugh carrying back to her on the cool spring air after some joke shared with Tommy. "I don't know what you mean," Martha said, though the flush rising in her cheeks rather undercut the denial. "Course you don't," Dell said, amusement crinkling the corners of his weathered eyes. "Man's gone soft on you too, for what it's worth. Whole ranch has taken bets on how long before one of you finally says the words plain instead of dancing around them. There are betting pools on my personal life now. There's a betting pool on near everything around here, Mrs. Whitaker. Weather calving numbers, whether Amos will ever learn to hold his tongue. You and Caleb just happen to be the most popular wager going this season." Martha laughed despite herself, though the observation lodged somewhere deep, a gentle prod toward a reckoning she'd been circling for weeks without quite allowing herself to land. She thought of Caleb's words during the storm, the raw honesty of his declaration, and the careful, measured response she'd given in return, promising more time before she could match his certainty with her own. That time, she realized, watching him disappear into the barn with Tommy trailing behind, was drawing to a close, whether she'd fully admitted it to herself or not. That evening after supper had been cleared and the crew had scattered to their various evening pursuits, Martha found herself sitting alone with Sarah Combs on the cookhouse porch, watching the last light drain from the western sky, while the younger woman worked at mending a torn apron. "Can I ask you something personal, Mrs. Whitaker?" Sarah said, not looking up from her stitching. "You can ask. I reserve the right not to answer." "Fair enough." Sarah tied off her thread before continuing. "Were you ever afraid loving Mr. Rowan? Given everything you'd been through before, all the ways people had hurt you, weren't you afraid to trust it even a little?" Martha considered the question seriously, appreciating the younger woman's evident need to understand something about her own tentative hopes, though she said nothing of the man Sarah occasionally mentioned from her previous position, a hand at a neighboring ranch who'd apparently caught her eye. "I was terrified," Martha admitted. "Every instinct I'd built over years of disappointment told me to keep my guard up, to wait for the moment his kindness revealed itself as calculation or condition. But Caleb never gave me a single reason to maintain that guard. Every test I set for him, consciously or not, he passed simply by being consistently unglamorously honest." "How did you know it was safe to finally believe him?" "I'm not sure I ever fully decided it was safe," Martha said. "I think eventually I simply got tired of protecting myself from a danger that never materialized. At some point, continuing to guard against a hurt that wasn't coming started to feel like its own kind of self-inflicted wound." Sarah nodded slowly, turning that observation over. "That's braver than it sounds, choosing to stop guarding yourself." "It didn't feel brave," Martha said. "It felt terrifying every single day, right up until it started to feel like the most natural thing in the world." She smiled slightly, watching the last color fade from the sky. "I suspect that's how most brave things work, if I'm honest. They don't feel courageous while you're living them. They only look that way afterward, once you've survived them and can see the shape of what you overcame." The conversation lingered in Martha's mind through the following days, resurfacing at odd moments as she worked through her morning routines, weighing her own readiness against the careful promise she'd made Caleb to take whatever time she needed before answering his declaration fully. She found examining her own heart with the same honest scrutiny she'd have applied to any difficult decision that the answer had been settling into place for weeks, already patient and certain, waiting only for the right moment to be spoken aloud. It was on a bright morning in early May, the valley finally shedding the last vestiges of winter's grip in favor of new grass and wildflowers scattered across the hillsides, that Caleb found her in the cookhouse garden tending the first seedlings of what would become, come summer, a proper vegetable plot to supplement the ranch's stores. "I want to show you something," he said, "if you can spare an hour away from your seedlings." "An hour's a luxury I don't often permit myself," Martha said, brushing dirt from her hands. "But I suspect you already know that, and I suspect you've got something in mind worth the indulgence." "I do," Caleb said, and something in his expression, careful and hopeful in equal measure, told her this outing carried more weight than a simple ride across the property. They rode together up toward the northern ridge that marked the boundary of Red Valley Ranch's grazing land, the horses picking their way easily along a trail Caleb clearly knew by heart. And as they climbed higher, the whole valley opened beneath them in a sweep of green and gold that stole Martha's breath more thoroughly than the thin mountain air. "This is where my father brought me the first time he explained what this ranch would someday mean," Caleb said, dismounting at the ridge's summit and helping Martha down beside him. "Told me a man doesn't inherit land. He inherits a responsibility, and the land only ever loans itself to whoever's willing to earn the right to tend it properly." Martha looked out over the valley, taking in the distant cattle grazing across new grass. The ranch buildings clustered small and distant, below the whole sweeping expanse of a life Caleb had spent 3 years building in quiet, careful stewardship. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I don't think I fully understood until this moment exactly how much land you're responsible for." "Nearly 40,000 acres, Caleb said. "More than any one man should rightly claim, though I've spent 3 years trying to prove myself worthy of the claim regardless." After my father passed, I nearly sold the whole operation. Grief made the responsibility feel unbearable, and I told myself a smaller life somewhere else might hurt less. What changed your mind? Otis mostly, Caleb admitted. He sat me down right here on this very ridge and told me my father hadn't built this ranch so his son could run from hard things the moment they got difficult. Told me the measure of a man wasn't whether he inherited something valuable, but whether he proved himself worthy of keeping it. He paused, his eyes moving across the valley with an expression that carried both pride and old grief in equal measure. I fought hard to keep this ranch, Martha. Fought creditors who wanted to carve it into smaller pieces. Fought my own grief and doubt, fought the temptation to simply walk away from a burden that felt some days entirely too heavy for one man to carry alone. You're not carrying it alone anymore. Martha said the words leaving her before she'd fully considered them, though she found she meant them completely. Caleb turned to face her fully, something raw and hopeful in his expression that matched the vulnerability she remembered from the night of the storm. That's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about up here, away from the ranch and the crew and every complication that comes with courting a woman while also being her employer. He took a breath, steadying himself. Martha, I didn't bring you up here to show you land I intend to give you, or land I expect you to feel obligated toward because of whatever grows between us. I brought you here because I wanted you to see plainly exactly what I'm offering when I ask you to consider a future with me, not a rescue. Not a kindness extended to make up for old failures. A partnership built on this land, tended by both our hands for as long as we both choose to keep tending it. Martha felt her heart racing, the weight of his words settling over her, with a clarity that cut through months of careful caution. Caleb, are you asking me to marry you? I am, Caleb said, though I want to be plain about what I'm asking and what I'm not. I'm not asking you to save me from loneliness, though God knows you've eased more of it than I expected any person could. I'm not asking you to complete some Wyoming debt I've been trying to settle since I first recognized you at that gate. I'm asking because I love you. Martha Whitaker entirely and without reservation for exactly who you are. Not despite your size, not despite your plainness of dress or manner, but because of the fierce, steady, remarkable woman you've proven yourself to be through every hard test this ranch and this life have thrown at you. Martha's eyes filled with tears. She made no effort to hide. This time, the accumulated weight of years spent believing herself unworthy of exactly this kind of declaration, finally breaking loose in a rush of emotion she'd guarded far too carefully for far too long. I've spent my whole life being told in 100 different ways that I was too much of something and not enough of something else, she said, her voice thick. Too large, not pretty enough, too plain, not delicate enough to deserve the kind of love people write songs about. I stopped expecting anyone would ever look at me the way you're looking at me right now. Then let me keep looking at you exactly this way for the rest of both our lives, Caleb said, reaching for her hands, holding them steady in his own weathered grip. I don't want a wife who diminishes herself to fit some narrow idea of what a rancher's bride ought to look like. I want you, Martha, precisely as you are running this ranch's kitchen with the same fierce competence you've shown since the day you arrived, standing beside me as an equal partner in every decision this land requires. What about the crew? What about the complications we discussed? The concerns about favoritism, about whether this ranch would ever fully accept a marriage between its owner and its cook. The crew already loves you, Caleb said. You've earned that love through months of honest work and honest care long before any of them knew my name, carried more weight than a hired hand's. Whatever complications arise, we'll face them together the same way we've faced every hard thing since the day you walked through that gate. Martha looked out over the valley once more, at the land Caleb had fought so hard to keep, at the life he was offering to build alongside her, rather than simply provide for her, and felt something settle deep in her chest. A certainty she'd been circling for weeks, finally crystallizing into unshakable clarity. Yes, she said. Yes, Caleb Rowan, I'll marry you. Caleb's answering smile broke across his face like sunrise after the longest night, and he pulled her into an embrace that carried none of the careful restraint he'd maintained through months of patient courtship, holding her tightly against him, while the wind swept across the ridge and the whole valley spread out beneath them like a promise finally kept. "I love you." Martha said the words coming easier now than she'd expected, all her careful caution finally giving way to simple, unguarded truth. "I think I've loved you since that night you carried me through the storm to find your fallen horse, though it's taken me this long to trust the feeling enough to name it plain." "I'll take loving me eventually," Caleb said, laughing against her hair, "so long as you keep loving me for the rest of our lives once you've started." "I intend to," Martha said, pulling back just enough to look up at him. "Though I reserve the right to be irritated with you on occasion, same as any reasonable wife reserves the right to be irritated with her husband." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Caleb said, and kissed her, then gentle and certain, the culmination of months of careful trust, finally given full and unguarded expression beneath the wide Montana sky. They rode back down from the ridge in comfortable silence, the weight of what had just passed between them, settling into something solid and certain, a foundation Martha suspected would carry them through whatever difficulties still lay ahead. By the time they reached the ranch yard, word had somehow already spread. Martha suspected Tommy Briggs, who'd spotted them departing that morning with a knowing grin that should have warned her the boy was drawing his own conclusions, and the whole crew had gathered near the barn, expressions ranging from barely contained excitement to outright grinning anticipation. "Well," Dell called out, unable to contain himself a moment longer. "Don't leave an old man in suspense, Mrs. Whitaker." Martha looked at Caleb, who nodded encouragingly, and she found herself smiling more freely than she had in longer than she could remember. "We're to be married," she announced, and the yard erupted into cheers, hats thrown into the air, Tommy whooping loud enough to startle the horses in the nearby corral. Amos, grinning wide despite his earlier shame over that first bitter afternoon, called out, "About damn time, if you'll pardon my language, ma'am." "Pardoned?" Martha said, laughing, given the occasion. Otis approached more slowly, his weathered face carrying an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show openly, and he shook Caleb's hand firmly before turning to Martha with genuine warmth in his eyes. "Your father would be proud, son," he told Caleb quietly. "Proud of the man you've become, and prouder still of the woman you've chosen to build your life alongside." "Thank you, Otis," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. For believing in me when I doubted myself, and for keeping faith that I'd eventually find my way to exactly this moment." The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening. Dell's fiddle brought out once more the whole crew gathering around a bonfire built in the yard to mark the occasion. Laughter and music carrying across the ranch in a way that felt to Martha like the natural culmination of everything she'd built since that first bitter afternoon, when she'd walked through the gate with nothing but an old bag and a stubborn refusal to be turned away. Sarah Combs found her during a quiet moment, offering a warm embrace despite their relatively brief acquaintance. "I'm so happy for you, Mrs. Whitaker," she said. "Watching you these past weeks, seeing how Mr. Rowan looks at you, it's given me hope that maybe love like that really does exist, even for women who've been told otherwise most of their lives." "It does exist," Martha said, squeezing Sarah's hands warmly. "Sometimes it just takes longer to find than we'd like, and sometimes it arrives disguised as a quiet cowboy who stacks wood by your door without ever asking for thanks." The wedding, when it came 3 weeks later, was a simple affair held in the ranch's newly expanded barn, decorated with wildflowers, gathered by Tommy Briggs. And the younger hands, the whole crew gathered to witness Martha Whitaker become Martha Rowan, in a ceremony performed by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through the valley at exactly the right moment. Martha wore her mother's old dress, altered carefully by Sarah's skilled hands to fit properly, and she carried tucked into her bouquet a small sprig of the wildflowers that had first bloomed on the ridge where Caleb had proposed. The morning of the ceremony, Sarah helped Martha dress in the small back room of the cookhouse, fussing over the fit of the altered gown, with the particular focus of a woman determined that every detail should be perfect. "You look beautiful," Sarah said, stepping back to admire her work. "Truly beautiful, Mrs. Whitaker, soon to be Mrs. Rowan." "I feel beautiful," Martha admitted, studying her reflection in the small mirror propped against the wall. "Which is a feeling I confess I never expected to carry into any wedding day of my own." You earned every bit of this happiness, Sarah said firmly. Don't let anyone, including your own doubts, tell you otherwise. Dell knocked softly at the door a few minutes later, offering his arm with old-fashioned gallantry. Figured somebody ought to walk you down, seeing as you've got no family present to do the honors, he said, his weathered face carrying more emotion than Martha had ever seen from him. Would be my honor if you'll permit it. I'd be glad of it, Dell, Martha said, her voice catching slightly. You've been more family to me these past months than most blood relations manage in a lifetime. The walk from the cookhouse to the barn passed in a blur of gathered wildflowers and smiling faces. The whole crew turned out in their best clothes, despite the ranch's remote location and limited access to finery. Every man present looking scrubbed and solemn and genuinely happy for the occasion unfolding before them. Standing before the assembled crew, before Otis and Dell and Tommy and even Amos, wiping unashamed tears from his weathered cheeks, Martha felt the full weight of everything she'd survived to reach exactly this moment. The cruelty of strangers, the loneliness of towns that never felt like home, the desperate walk through a Montana blizzard toward a ranch that had against every expectation become the truest home she'd ever known. I, Martha, take you, Caleb, she said, her voice steady and sure, not as a rescue from loneliness, not as an escape from hardship, but as an equal partner in whatever this life brings us, storm or sunshine, hardship or plenty, for as long as we both shall live. Caleb's eyes shone with unguarded emotion as he repeated similar vows, his voice carrying none of the careful reserve that had once characterized every interaction between them. And when the preacher finally pronounced them husband and wife, the whole barn erupted into cheers that Martha suspected could be heard clear to the county seat. Amos, seated near the front with tears still tracking unashamed down his weathered face, called out, "Never thought I'd see the day, but I'm awful glad I lived to witness it." And the resulting laughter carried the last of the ceremony's formal solemnity into something warmer, more joyful, entirely fitting for two people who had built their union on hard-won honesty rather than empty tradition. The days that followed settled into a rhythm richer than anything Martha had known before her role on the ranch, expanding naturally into a partnership that touched every aspect of the operation, her voice carrying equal weight to Caleb's in decisions large and small. She continued running the kitchen, training Sarah toward eventual independence, while also taking on broader responsibilities that came naturally to a woman who'd spent her whole life learning to manage difficult circumstances with grace and unshakable competence. It was nearly a year after that first bitter afternoon when Martha had walked through the gate of Red Valley Ranch, carrying nothing but an old bag and a stubborn refusal to be turned away, that she found herself standing once more at that same gate, though everything about the moment had transformed entirely. Winter had returned to the valley softer this time, less menacing, the ranch well-provisioned and thriving under the combined stewardship of a husband and wife who'd built something remarkable from the wreckage of old griefs and hard-won trust. She looked out at the land, stretching white and beautiful beneath the winter sky, at the cookhouse, smoke curling steady from its chimney, at the barn, where her husband was surely working alongside Tommy and the other hands, and felt a profound gratitude settle over her, deeper and more complete than any emotion she'd allowed herself to feel in the desperate years before Montana had claimed her. She was no longer the desperate woman who'd once stood at this gate seeking nothing more than honest work and a fair wage. She was Martha Rowan now, co-owner of Red Valley Ranch, a woman who had built her worth through her own hands and proven it beyond any doubt to a crew that had once mocked her arrival and now called her friend, wife, and equal partner in every sense that mattered. Caleb found her there at the gate and came to stand beside her, his arm settling naturally around her shoulders as they looked out together over the land that had become, through hardship and honesty and hard-won love, entirely and completely their shared home. "Regrets?" he asked softly, echoing a question he'd asked once before, in gentler circumstances, when their future together had still felt uncertain and new. "Not one," Martha said, leaning into him with the easy comfort of a woman entirely certain of her place in the world. "Every hard road led me exactly here to exactly this life, and I wouldn't trade a single mile of that difficult journey for an easier path that might have kept me from ever finding you." They turned together and walked back toward the cookhouse, toward the warmth and light waiting inside, toward the life they had built, through patience, honesty, and unwavering respect for exactly who each of them was, flaws and strength. Both. Martha pushed open the cookhouse door, stepped inside and began building up the fire for the evening supper, her movements sure and practiced the rhythm of a life she had chosen freely and completely, without a trace of desperation left in her bones. She was home. She had always, from that first bitter afternoon at the gate, been building toward exactly this. Not merely survival, not merely acceptance, but a life entirely her own, earned through her own strength, and chosen finally by a love that saw her whole and found her worthy, exactly as she was. Tommy Briggs came running up as she worked, breathless as always, with news he clearly considered urgent. "Mrs. Rowan! Mrs. Rowan, come quick. One of the mares is close to foaling, and Mr. Rowan says you'll want to see it, seeing as how you helped nurse her through that hard winter." Martha wiped her hands on her apron. The familiar warmth of being needed, being included, being trusted with the full life of this ranch, rather than merely its kitchen, settling over her like the most comfortable of garments. "Tell him I'm coming," she said, and followed the boy out into the crisp winter air. Her steps sure and unhurried, a woman entirely certain of her place in the world she had built for herself, one hard-won day at a time. She found Caleb in the barn, kneeling beside the straining mare, with the same gentle, capable hands that had once bandaged her own injured wrist, that had once carried a wounded horse's rider half a mile through screaming wind, that had, across a year of hardship and honesty, built something enduring between them that neither cruelty nor doubt nor old Wyoming ghosts had managed to diminish. "Thought you'd want to be here," he said, glancing up as she settled beside him in the straw. "Always," Martha said, and meant it completely in every sense the word could carry. They worked together through the birth, the same wordless efficiency that had characterized their partnership since that first desperate blizzard rescue, and when the foal finally stood on wobbling legs, nuzzling against its exhausted mother. Martha felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sorrow this time, nor even relief, but from the simple, overwhelming gratitude of a life lived fully, honestly, and without apology for exactly who she was. "Every season on this ranch brings something new to be grateful for," she said, watching the foal take its first uncertain steps. "I didn't expect that when I first walked through that gate. I expected hard work and fair wages, nothing more. I never imagined I'd find an entire life waiting for me here." "Neither did I," Caleb admitted, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as they watched the new life steady itself in the straw. "But I'm grateful every single day that you walked through that gate anyway, cold and exhausted, and utterly unwilling to be turned away." Martha leaned into him, watching the newborn foal find its balance in the lantern-lit barn, and felt the full, complete certainty of a woman who had finally, after every hard mile of her difficult journey, found not merely a home, but a life entirely worth the living. She had come to Red Valley Ranch seeking nothing more than honest work. She had found instead everything she had ever truly deserved: respect earned through her own hands, love chosen freely, rather than granted from pity, and a place in the world where her worth was never once measured by anything other than the strength of her character and the steadiness of her heart. That was worth every hard mile it had taken her to arrive here, and it would remain hers unshaken and complete for every single day still ahead.